Hello, everyone. Tonight I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Radio Voice. The woman standing beside the overturned car on Highway 12 wasn't waving for help or showing signs of distress, which was the first thing that struck Clara as unusual about the accident scene that appeared in her headlights during the lonely hours before dawn. Instead, she was speaking into something, holding her hands cupped as if around a microphone or radio device. Though Clara couldn't see any communication equipment or identify what the woman might be using to transmit whatever urgent message she was attempting to deliver, her lips moved constantly in the pattern of someone engaged in serious conversation, and she gestured with the kind of emphasis that suggested she was trying to communicate critical information to someone who couldn't see her current circumstances or understand the urgency of her situation without detailed verbal explanation. Clara pulled her milk tanker over to the shoulder and grabbed her first aid kit, responding to what appeared to be a serious traffic accident that would require immediate medical attention and emergency coordination with appropriate authorities. The car, a small sedan that looked like it had been designed for commuter transport rather than highway travel, had rolled multiple times before coming to rest on its roof in the gravel beside the highway, creating the kind of devastating impact patterns that usually resulted in serious injuries or fatalities requiring immediate professional medical intervention. But the woman standing beside the wreckage was uninjured, wearing a simple dress and comfortable shoes that suggested she had been prepared for a casual trip, rather than the kind of emergency situation that now surrounded her. She looked like someone who had stepped out of her vehicle to assess minor mechanical problems, rather than someone who had survived the kind of violent rollover accident that should have left her trapped, injured, or worse. "Are you hurt?" Clara called as she approached with her medical supplies, making the kind of immediate assessment that her EMT training had taught her to prioritize when encountering potential trauma victims who might be in shock or experiencing injuries that weren't immediately visible but could prove life-threatening without prompt intervention. The woman looked up from her invisible communication device, and Clara saw she was holding nothing at all. Her hands were cupped around empty air, as if she possessed a microphone that existed only in her perception or memory. There was no radio equipment visible, no cell phone, no communication device of any kind that would explain her apparent conversation with unseen parties who required constant updates about her situation and location. "Oh, thank goodness," the woman said, her voice carrying the relief of someone who had been waiting longer than was comfortable for assistance that might not have materialized without Clara's intervention. "I've been trying to reach someone for help." Her statement suggested ongoing efforts to communicate with emergency services or family members, but the absence of any visible communication equipment made her activities seem delusional or supernatural, rather than practical and goal-oriented. Clara looked around the immediate area, searching for radio equipment that might have been thrown from the vehicle during the accident, or communication devices that could explain the woman's behavior and apparent conversation with invisible parties. No cell towers were visible in this remote location, no radio repeaters or communication infrastructure that would enable long-distance transmission of emergency calls or coordination with authorities who could provide assistance and medical evaluation. "Who were you trying to call?" Clara asked, hoping to understand the nature of the woman's communication attempts and whether she was dealing with medical shock, psychological trauma, or supernatural phenomena that transcended normal categories of accident response and emergency assistance. "My husband. He's driving this route tonight, and I need to warn him about the accident." The woman gestured toward the overturned car with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who was dealing with practical problems that required immediate attention and coordination. "There's ice on the road at mile marker 47. He needs to slow down before he reaches the dangerous section. Clara checked the pavement around them, looking for evidence of the icy conditions that the woman claimed had caused her accident, and continued to threaten other travelers who might encounter the same hazards. It was a warm September evening with clear skies and mild temperatures that precluded any possibility of ice formation. And, according to the roadside marker they had passed, their current location was mile 23 rather than the mile 47 that the woman kept referencing in her warnings. "Ma'am, I think you might be confused," Clara said gently, using the careful tone that medical professionals employed when dealing with patients who might be experiencing disorientation or cognitive impairment as a result of trauma or shock. "Do you need medical attention? Should I call an ambulance to have you evaluated by emergency room physicians?" No, I'm fine, but Jimmy's not." The woman's voice carried increasing urgency as she raised her empty hands to her mouth again, speaking into the invisible microphone with the practiced cadence of someone who had spent countless hours communicating over radio frequencies and was comfortable with the protocols and language that characterize professional radio operations. "Breaker 19, this is Angel Eyes calling for Moondog. Jimmy, if you can hear me, you need to slow down. There's black ice at mile marker 47. Clara felt a chill despite the warm evening air as she recognized the CB radio handles and communication patterns that the woman was using, terminology that belonged to the trucking community and suggested familiarity with long-haul transportation and the radio networks that connected drivers across vast distances. The woman was speaking into a CB radio that wasn't there, using trucker handles like she'd been on the road for years and understood the culture and communication protocols that governed highway transportation. "What's your name?" Clara asked, hoping to establish the woman's identity and begin the process of determining what kind of assistance she needed and whether her apparent radio communications represented medical emergency or supernatural phenomena. Betty Kowalski. I've been Jimmy's eyes and ears for 23 years, ever since he started driving long haul." Betty's voice carried the practiced competence and professional pride that characterized people who had found meaningful roles in supporting transportation operations and ensuring the safety of drivers who depended on accurate information and timely warnings about road conditions and potential hazards. "Where is Jimmy now?" Clara asked, trying to understand the current location and circumstances of the husband whose safety seemed to be Betty's primary concern, despite her own recent accident and the traumatic circumstances that should have made her focus on personal medical needs rather than warning others about dangers that might not actually exist. "About 10 miles north, heading this way. He's tired, been driving for 14 hours straight, and he won't see the ice until it's too late." Betty continued her radio communications, speaking into empty air with the desperate urgency of someone who understood that lives depended on timely warnings and accurate information about changing road conditions. "Jimmy, please answer. Your angel eyes need you to copy." Clara looked at the overturned car more carefully, noting details that began to change her understanding of the situation and the nature of Betty's accident and current circumstances. The vehicle was old, covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested it had been sitting in this location for an extended period rather than having recently crashed during the current evening. Through the shattered windshield, she could see personal belongings scattered inside: a woman's purse, a CB radio mounted to the dashboard that looked like it belonged to an earlier era of communication technology. The radio equipment was vintage, probably from the 1990s, and showed signs of weather damage and long exposure to environmental conditions that had corroded the metal components and faded the plastic housing. It was the kind of equipment that serious radio operators used before cell phones became ubiquitous and CB communication became less essential for highway safety and driver coordination. "Betty," Clara said carefully, choosing her words to avoid either disbelief or premature conclusions about what she was witnessing. "When did this accident happen?" "About an hour ago." I was coming home from the grocery store, taking the back road because Jimmy always says the main highway gets too busy during peak hours. But I hit that ice patch and Betty gestured vaguely at the overturned car with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who was more concerned about warning others than dwelling on personal misfortune or seeking sympathy for circumstances that couldn't be changed through discussion. Clara walked around the car and found the license plate, taking a photo with her phone so she could research the vehicle's registration and ownership history through databases that would provide information about the accident and its timeline. The license plate was old and weathered, showing signs of exposure that suggested years rather than hours of environmental damage. She ran a quick search through her phone's internet connection, and what she discovered made her hands shake and her understanding of Betty's situation shift dramatically. The car was registered to Betty Kowalski, and according to DMV records, Betty had been declared deceased 3 years ago following a single vehicle accident on Highway 12 that matched the location and circumstances of the overturned car she was now examining. Betty, Clara said, her voice carrying the gentle firmness that characterized difficult conversations about subjects that most people preferred to avoid, I need to tell you something important. But Betty was speaking into her invisible radio again, her voice carrying increasing desperation as she attempted to establish contact with her husband and deliver warnings that she believed were essential for his safety and survival. Moondog, this is Angel Eyes. You're approaching mile marker 45. Please slow down. Please copy. Clara looked north along the highway and saw headlights in the distance. A big rig approaching at normal highway speed through the darkness. The truck was still several miles away, but it was clearly heading in their direction and would reach the area Betty had identified as dangerous within the next 20 minutes if it maintained its current pace and route. She checked the mile marker again, confirming that they were at mile 23, which meant the truck would reach mile 47 in approximately 20 minutes if it continued at highway speed, without encountering delays or changing its intended route. But there was no ice at mile marker 47, no weather conditions that would create the hazards that Betty continued to broadcast in her warnings to her husband. Betty, there is no ice at mile marker 47, Clara said, hoping to ground their conversation in observable reality rather than the supernatural circumstances that seemed to be governing Betty's perception and communication attempts. Yes, there is. Betty's voice carried absolute certainty, the conviction of someone who possessed direct knowledge of conditions that others might not be able to observe or verify through normal means. Same patch that got me. Same place where Jimmy's going to crash if someone doesn't warn him in time. The headlights were getting closer, and Clara could hear the distinctive sound of a diesel engine echoing across the hills as the truck approached their location. Betty continued her radio calls with increasing frequency and urgency, speaking into empty air with the desperation of someone who knew that time was running out, and that failure to establish communication could result in tragedy and loss that would devastate families and communities. Danger Eyes to Moondog, Jimmy, I know you can hear me. You always hear me when I need you most. Betty's voice carried the intimate knowledge and deep affection that characterized marriages built on decades of mutual support and shared experiences. Relationships where partners had learned to communicate across distances and coordinate their activities despite the challenges and separations that came with transportation careers. Clara made a decision that challenged her understanding of reality but seemed necessary given the supernatural circumstances she was witnessing. She grabbed her own CB radio from her truck and tuned to Channel 19, the frequency that truckers used for highway communication and coordination. Breaker 19, northbound 18-wheeler approaching mile marker 45. You've got a concerned party here, requesting you slow down for mile marker 47. The radio crackled to life with a response that made Clara's blood freeze and her understanding of the situation shift into territories where normal causality and temporal sequence no longer applied predictably. Copy that, good buddy. This is Moondog. Did someone say Angel Eyes was calling for me? Clara felt her breath catch as she realized that the driver whose safety Betty was trying to protect was not only real, but was monitoring the same radio frequency and responding to communications that suggested ongoing rather than historical relationships. The voice on the radio carried the emotional weight of someone who was shocked to hear familiar call signs and communication patterns that belonged to earlier periods of his life. "Jimmy!" Betty called, though she still held no visible radio equipment and was speaking into empty air with the same desperate urgency that had characterized her attempts to establish communication since Clara had arrived at the accident scene. "Yes, it's me. You need to slow down, honey. Please, be careful. Angel Eyes." The voice on the radio was confused, carrying emotional weight that suggested recognition of someone who should not have been able to communicate over normal radio frequencies. "Betty, is that really you? How is this possible?" "It's me, Jimmy. I'm okay, but you need to listen to me. Slow down for mile marker 47. There's danger there." Betty's voice carried the authority and intimate knowledge that characterized communications between spouses who had worked together for decades, and developed the kind of trust that made warnings credible and urgent rather than casual suggestions that could be ignored or postponed. Clara watched the headlights approach mile marker 47 and saw the truck's brake lights illuminate as the driver responded to warnings that transcended normal radio communication and involved supernatural coordination between living and dead partners who maintained connection despite circumstances that should have made such communication impossible. The big rig slowed to a crawl as it passed the marker, then gradually resumed normal highway speed after navigating whatever hazards or dangers Betty had identified through supernatural knowledge that extended beyond normal human perception of road conditions and weather patterns. "Angel Eyes," came the voice on the radio, thick with tears and emotional weight that suggested years of grief and unresolved communication. "I miss you so much. I've been trying to hear your voice for 3 years, since the accident that took you away from me. I know, honey. I've been trying to reach you too, but I think this might be our last conversation." Betty's voice carried the resignation of someone who understood that supernatural communication operated according to different rules and limitations than normal human interaction, requiring special circumstances and assistance that might not be available for extended periods. "Wei." The question carried the desperation of someone who had finally re-established contact with a lost loved one and was unwilling to accept that the reunion might be temporary or limited by supernatural constraints. Betty looked at Clara with eyes full of sorrow and love that transcended normal categories of human emotion, carrying the weight of someone who had spent 3 years trying to complete communications that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond her control. "Because someone else heard me tonight. Someone else passed along my message. I don't think I need to keep trying anymore." The radio was quiet for a long moment, filled with the kind of silence that characterized conversations where participants were processing information that challenged their understanding of life and death, and the possibility of continued communication beyond normal biological constraints. Then, "Thank you, Angel Eyes, for everything. For 23 years of keeping me safe on the highway. I love you." "I love you too, Moondog. 10-4 and out." Betty lowered her hands from her invisible microphone and looked at Clara with an expression that combined gratitude with the peace that comes from completing important work and fulfilling obligations that had transcended death and continued to operate according to supernatural principles. "Thank you for helping me reach him," Betty said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had finally accomplished a mission that had required 3 years of supernatural effort and persistence. "For believing in what you couldn't see or understand." "What was really at mile marker 47, Clara asked, hoping to understand whether Betty's warnings had been based on supernatural knowledge of actual dangers or represented something more complex about the relationship between love, guilt, and the persistence of protective instincts beyond normal biological limitations. Nothing tonight. But 3 years ago when I died, Jimmy was on this same route. If I could have warned him then, if someone had passed along my message, he would have known to slow down. He would have seen my car in time. Betty's form was beginning to fade in the evening light, becoming translucent as her supernatural mission approached completion, and her need to maintain physical presence diminished. Clara felt tears in her eyes as she understood the full scope of Betty's supernatural dedication and the tragedy that had created her ongoing obligation to protect her husband from dangers that existed more in memory than immediate reality. He was there when you crashed, found me 20 minutes too late. He's been blaming himself ever since, thinking that if he'd been monitoring the radio, if he'd heard me calling for help. Betty's voice carried the understanding of someone who had spent 3 years observing the guilt and self-recrimination that had consumed her husband since her death. Tonight, I finally got to warn him about danger, even if it was 3 years late. Betty walked toward the overturned car and simply disappeared, leaving Clara alone on the empty highway, with the increasing understanding that love could transcend normal boundaries between life and death, creating communication channels that operated according to principles that had nothing to do with technology or physics. The car remained as evidence of the accident, but it looked different now, older, more weathered, like it had been sitting in that location for years rather than hours. Clara's radio crackled one more time with a transmission that carried both gratitude and closure. "This is Moondog. To whoever helped my angel eyes tonight, thank you. You gave us both something we needed, the chance to say goodbye properly and complete communications that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond our control." Clara drove north and caught up with Jimmy's truck at a rest stop about 20 miles ahead, where she found him sitting at a picnic table with a cup of coffee that had grown cold while he processed the supernatural encounter that had reconnected him with his deceased wife for one final conversation. He was an older man, maybe 60, with the weathered appearance and careful movements that characterized people who had spent their lives on highways and understood both the dangers and the deep satisfactions that came with transportation careers. They talked for an hour over coffee that grew cold while he told her about Betty and their 23 years of marriage, built around trucking operations that had taken him across the country while she provided support, coordination, and the kind of partnership that made dangerous work safer and lonely travel more bearable. "She saved my life more times than I can count," Jimmy said, his voice carrying the appreciation and love that had sustained their relationship through decades of separation and the challenges that came with careers that required constant travel and time away from home. Traffic jams, bad weather, construction zones. She always knew what was ahead, always kept me safe. "What happened to her?" Clara asked, though she suspected the answer would involve the kind of tragic accident that made highway travel dangerous despite modern safety equipment and improved road design. "Car accident on Highway 12. I was on the same route that night, about 20 miles behind her when she hit that ice patch and rolled her car. If I'd been monitoring the radio, if I'd heard her call for help." He shook his head with the weight of someone who had carried guilt and self-recrimination for 3 years without finding resolution or peace. "She doesn't blame you," Clara said, her statement based on her supernatural encounter with Betty and the understanding she had gained about the true nature of Betty's ongoing communication attempts. Jimmy looked at her sharply, his expression carrying both hope and skepticism about the possibility that his guilt might be unfounded, or that his wife's spirit held no resentment about his failure to provide assistance when she needed it most. "How do you know that?" "Because tonight she was still trying to keep you safe, still watching out for you. That's not guilt or blame talking, that's love." Clara's explanation was based on her observation of Betty's behavior and priorities, which had focused entirely on Jimmy's safety rather than her own circumstances or the need for sympathy about her supernatural situation. Jimmy returned to the road that night, but Clara heard later that he had retired within the month, finally accepting that some journeys were meant to end and that he had received the message his angel eyes had been trying to send for 3 years. The supernatural communication had provided both closure and permission to move forward, allowing him to understand that love could transcend death, while also accepting that some relationships required different forms of expression after biological constraints made normal interaction impossible. Love, Clara learned, was the strongest signal of all, capable of reaching across death and time and the static of 3 years' worth of unanswered calls and interrupted communications. And sometimes all it needed was someone willing to believe in voices that came from empty air, someone willing to serve as a relay station for messages that transcended normal categories of communication and connected hearts that refused to accept that distance or death could completely interrupt the conversations that had sustained them through decades of partnership and mutual support. Story 2. The Night Shift. The security guard standing at the entrance to the abandoned factory looked official enough. Uniform pressed and clean, badge polished to mere brightness, clipboard in hand with the kind of systematic attention to detail that characterized professional security operations. But Marcus couldn't figure out why anyone would be guarding a building that had been closed for 15 years, standing watch over industrial equipment that had been scrapped and sold for salvage decades earlier, maintaining security protocols for facilities that no longer held anything valuable enough to steal or protect from vandalism and urban exploration. Marcus had been driving this route through Pennsylvania's Rust Belt for a decade, hauling steel from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia along highways that passed through the industrial heartland that had once powered American manufacturing but now consisted largely of empty buildings and abandoned infrastructure that spoke of economic changes and global competition that had transformed entire regions. He knew every factory, every mill, every shuttered plant along the way, facilities that had employed thousands of workers during their operational years, but now stood empty as monuments to industries that had moved elsewhere or evolved beyond the need for American labor and production capacity. The Meridian Steel Works had been dark since 2007, its windows broken by weather and vandalism, parking lot overgrown with weeds that had pushed through cracks in the asphalt to create an industrial garden where wildflowers and saplings grew among the ruins of what had once been carefully maintained corporate property. The facility had been one of the larger employers in the region, providing steady work for generations of families who had built their lives around shift schedules and union contracts that had promised economic security and middle-class prosperity for anyone willing to work hard and follow safety protocols. But tonight there was a man in a security uniform standing at the gate, waving for Marcus to stop with authority of someone who had legitimate business concerns and needed to coordinate with highway traffic about matters that affected both industrial operations and public safety. Marcus pulled his 18-wheeler over and rolled down the window, responding to what appeared to be official security activity, even though the timing and location seemed inconsistent with normal industrial operations. "You need something?" The guard approached with the professional bearing that characterized people who had worked in security and law enforcement, carrying himself with the alert confidence of someone who was accustomed to dealing with potential threats and maintaining order in environments where safety and property protection required constant vigilance. "Sorry to bother you, but we've had some break-ins. Kids mostly, but the company wants extra patrols tonight." Marcus looked past the guard at the factory complex, noting details that contradicted the security concerns that were supposedly motivating increased patrol activity. From this angle, he could see lights in some of the windows. Not the harsh fluorescent illumination that characterized modern industrial facilities, but the warm glow of incandescent bulbs that belonged to earlier eras of factory lighting, when energy efficiency was less important than providing adequate illumination for workers who needed to see dangerous machinery and moving parts clearly enough to avoid injury. "Company? I thought this place was shut down years ago," Marcus said, expressing his confusion about the ongoing security operations and industrial activity that seemed to be taking place in a facility that he had understood to be permanently closed and abandoned. "Skeleton Crew. the guard explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who was providing routine information about normal business operations. "They're doing some equipment maintenance, getting ready to possibly reopen production lines. You haven't seen anyone suspicious around here, have you? Young kids, maybe carrying spray paint or crowbars for vandalism activities?" Marcus shook his head, confirming that he had observed no unusual activity during his regular travels along this route. "Just me on the road tonight. Pretty quiet shift so far." His response was truthful but carried growing confusion about the disconnect between his understanding of the facility's status and the apparent security concerns that were motivating increased surveillance and protection activities. Good. Thanks for keeping an eye out," the guard said, stepping back and waving him on with the professional courtesy that characterized interactions between security personnel and members of the public who were willing to assist with crime prevention and community safety. "Drive safe." Marcus pulled back onto the highway, but something nagged at him about the encounter, creating persistent unease that had nothing to do with traffic conditions or mechanical concerns, but rather with the growing sense that he had witnessed something that didn't fit normal patterns of industrial security and facility management. He had driven past the Meridian plant countless times during his years on this route, and it had always been completely dark, showing no signs of security presence or ongoing maintenance activities that would justify the kind of professional surveillance he had just encountered. 5 miles down the road, he called his dispatcher on the satellite phone, needing to verify information about the facility and resolve his confusion about the apparent resumption of operations at a plant he had understood to be permanently closed. "Hey, Sarah, can you look something up for me? Meridian Steelworks in Johnstown? Are they reopening or doing any kind of maintenance that would require security coverage?" "Hold on." He could hear typing as his dispatcher accessed industry databases and company records that tracked the operational status of major manufacturing facilities throughout their service territory. "Meridian Steel, no, Marcus. Company went bankrupt in 2007. Building's been abandoned ever since. Actually, it's scheduled for demolition next month to clear the site for redevelopment." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning as he processed information that contradicted what he had just observed and experienced during his encounter with the security guard. "You sure? I just saw a security guard there, said they had crews working inside and were concerned about break-ins and vandalism." "Definitely not. The place has been empty for 15 years. No security, no maintenance, no activity of any kind." Sarah's voice carried the certainty of someone who was accessing official records and verified information. "Why do you ask? Did you see something unusual that we should report to local authorities?" "Just curious. Thanks, Sarah." Marcus hung up and checked his mirrors, looking back toward the factory complex that was now several miles behind him. In the distance, he could still see the glow from windows that should have been dark and empty, illumination that suggested ongoing activity in a facility that officially had been abandoned for over a decade. The next night, Marcus took the same route and slowed down as he approached the factory, driven by curiosity and the need to understand what he had witnessed during his previous encounter with the security guard. The guard was there again, standing at the gate with his clipboard and maintaining the same professional vigilance that had characterized their earlier interaction. But this time, Marcus pulled over and got out of his truck, deciding to investigate more directly rather than simply accepting explanations that contradicted his understanding of the facility's operational status. He needed to understand what was really happening at the Meridian plant and whether he was dealing with legitimate security operations or something that transcended normal categories of industrial management and property protection. "Evening," the guard said, greeting Marcus with the same professional courtesy that had characterized their previous encounter. "Quiet night again?" "Yeah, real quiet." Marcus studied the man's face more carefully, looking for signs that might reveal the true nature of his presence and activities at the abandoned factory. "What's your name, if you don't mind me asking?" "Bill Henderson. Been working security here for 8 years. the guard replied with the straightforward honesty that characterized people who had nothing to hide and were comfortable discussing their professional responsibilities and work history. Marcus looked at the factory behind Bill, noting that the lights were on again, and that through the broken windows he could see figures moving around inside, workers in hard hats and coveralls, going about their business as if the plant was operating at full capacity, and production schedules required round-the-clock activity to meet delivery commitments and maintain operational efficiency. "Bill," Marcus said carefully, choosing his words to avoid offense while addressing the growing disconnect between official records and his own observations. "When did Meridian Steel close?" Bill frowned with the confusion of someone who had been asked a question that didn't make sense given his understanding of current circumstances and operational status. "Close? We're not closed. Busy night tonight, actually. Third shift is running a full crew to meet production deadlines." Marcus walked closer to the fence and peered through the chain link, studying the activity inside the factory complex with growing amazement and confusion. Inside the facility, he could see conveyor belts moving with mechanical precision, sparks flying from welding stations where workers were assembling steel components, equipment operating at full capacity with the kind of industrial activity that characterized major manufacturing operations during peak production periods. But there was something wrong with the scene, something that didn't conform to normal visual perception and industrial reality. The entire operation looked like an old photograph that had somehow been brought to life, everything slightly faded and soft-edged, as if it existed in a different temporal dimension or was being viewed through some kind of historical filter that made contemporary events appear to belong to earlier eras. "Bill, what year is it?" Marcus asked, hoping to understand the temporal displacement that seemed to be affecting the guard's perception of current events and industrial operations. 2007, of course. December 15th, 2007. Last shift before the Christmas break, Bill replied, consulting his clipboard with the confidence of someone who was certain about dates and schedules that governed his work responsibilities. "Company says we'll be back after New Year's, but I don't know. There have been rumors going around about layoffs and possible plant closure." Marcus felt his mouth go dry as he realized that Bill was experiencing time differently, existing in a temporal bubble that had preserved the final days of the factory's operation and prevented him from understanding that 15 years had passed since the events he was describing as current circumstances. "Bill, it's 2022. This factory closed 15 years ago." Bill looked at him with confusion that gradually transformed into concern and worry about Marcus's mental state and grasp of reality. "Sir, are you feeling all right? Maybe you should sit down and rest for a moment." "Look at my truck," Marcus said, pointing to his rig with its modern equipment and contemporary styling. "Look at the license plates, the inspection stickers. What year do they show?" Bill squinted at the truck with increasing confusion as his supernatural perception began to process information that contradicted his understanding of current reality and temporal circumstances. His expression slowly changed as the confusion faded and was replaced by a dawning comprehension that brought him visible pain and emotional distress. "No," he whispered, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who is confronting truths too painful to accept or integrate into his understanding of his own existence and purpose. "No, that can't be right." "Bill, what's the last thing you remember clearly?" Marcus asked gently, using the careful tone that people employed when helping others process traumatic information or recover suppressed memories that might be too painful for normal conscious awareness. Bill's hands shook as he dropped his clipboard, the professional composure that had characterized his demeanor dissolving as he accessed memories that revealed the true nature of his circumstances and the reason for his ongoing presence at the abandoned factory. There was an accident, explosion in the blast furnace. I was making my rounds, checking the perimeter for security threats when I heard this sound like thunder. Then, nothing. Marcus watched as the lights in the factory began to flicker and dim, the sounds of industrial machinery growing fainter and less distinct, as Bill's supernatural perception of ongoing operations began to fade in response to his growing awareness of actual circumstances and the passage of time. The figures working inside the factory moved more slowly, their activities becoming less focused and purposeful as the supernatural recreation of normal operations began to dissolve. How many workers were inside when the accident happened? Marcus asked, hoping to understand the scope of the tragedy that had created the supernatural situation he was witnessing. 43 on the night shift. Good people, all of them. Families, kids, people who had devoted their lives to this company and depended on steady employment to support their loved ones. Bill's voice broke as he contemplated the human cost of the industrial accident that had ended not only his own life, but the lives of dozens of co-workers who had trusted in safety protocols and industrial practices that had proven inadequate to prevent catastrophic failure. The factory was going dark now, window by window, as the supernatural recreation of normal operations finally succumbed to Bill's growing awareness of reality and the passage of time. The workers inside seemed to be fading away, their forms becoming translucent before disappearing entirely, as the industrial activity that had sustained their presence finally acknowledged the impossibility of continuing operations in a facility that no longer existed in any functional sense. Soon there was only darkness and silence, the empty shell of a building that had once employed hundreds of people and contributed to the economic vitality of an entire region. 15 years, Bill said, staring at the dark factory with the understanding of someone who had finally grasped the scope of time that had passed without his awareness. We've been working for 15 years, thinking tomorrow would come, thinking we'd get to go home to our families and continue our normal lives. Why didn't you move on? Marcus asked, hoping to understand the supernatural mechanics that had trapped the workers in cycles of repetitive industrial activity, long after their deaths had made such work impossible and meaningless. Because this was our job, our responsibility. The company depended on us, and we didn't want to let them down or abandon our obligations. Bill smiled sadly as he contemplated the loyalty and dedication that had kept him and his co-workers reporting for duty, despite circumstances that should have released them from all earthly obligations and employment relationships. Funny thing about loyalty, it can trap you just as easily as it can save you. We were so committed to doing our jobs well that we couldn't accept that our shift had finally ended. Bill began to fade as well, becoming less solid with each passing moment as his understanding of current reality replaced the supernatural persistence that had maintained his presence at the factory for 15 years. Thank you for telling me the truth, for helping me understand that it was time to finally clock out and go home. What will you do now? Marcus asked, curious about the destination and activities that awaited someone who had spent 15 years in supernatural employment and was finally ready to accept retirement from duties that had extended far beyond normal career expectations. Go home. Finally go home to the rest and peace that we should have found 15 years ago. Bill looked back at the dark factory one last time with the expression of someone who was saying goodbye to a workplace that had defined his identity and purpose for decades. Tell people about us, will you? Tell them we were good workers, that we cared about doing our jobs right and meeting our responsibilities. Bill disappeared completely, leaving Marcus alone by the empty factory that had finally acknowledged its true status as an abandoned ruin rather than an operating industrial facility. The next morning, he called the local newspaper and told them about his encounter with the supernatural security guard and the workers who had been maintaining impossible shifts for 15 years after their deaths. The reporter was initially skeptical until Marcus mentioned the names Bill had given him, 43 workers who had died in the Meridian steel explosion that had marked the end of an era in American manufacturing and the beginning of economic decline that had affected entire regions. The article that ran the following week was a memorial piece honoring the workers who had died 15 years earlier while trying to complete their shifts and maintain production schedules that had seemed more important than personal safety. Several family members contacted the paper after the article was published, saying they had always felt their loved ones were still out there somewhere, still working the night shift and maintaining the kind of professional dedication that had characterized their entire careers. The supernatural persistence had provided both comfort and concern for families who wanted their deceased relatives to find peace, but also took pride in the work ethic and commitment that had defined their lives. Marcus drove past the factory many times after that encounter, but it was always dark and empty, showing no signs of the supernatural activity that had maintained the illusion of ongoing operations for 15 years. The demolition crew that arrived the following month found something interesting in the security office. Time cards for 43 workers, all punched in for December 15, 2007, with dates that had been updated every night for 15 years, as if someone had been faithfully recording their presence and maintaining employment records for workers who had continued reporting for duty long after their earthly obligations had technically ended. Some jobs, Marcus learned, created bonds stronger than death, professional relationships and workplace loyalty that transcended normal employment contracts and continued operating according to supernatural principles long after the companies that had originally employed them had ceased to exist. And some workers were so dedicated to their responsibilities that they couldn't accept that their shift had finally ended, that the time clock had stopped running, and that they had earned the right to rest after decades of faithful service to industrial operations that had shaped their identities and provided meaning for their entire adult lives. But once they understood that their long workday was over, that their final shift had been completed and their employment records could be closed, they could finally punch out and go home to the rest they had earned through years of dedication, loyalty, and the kind of professional commitment that had made American manufacturing great during its peak years of productivity and economic influence. Story 3, The Last Mile. The final story began like all the others, with a figure beside the road, thumb extended toward the endless highway that stretched across the American landscape, like a concrete river connecting distant cities and isolated communities. But this time, truck driver Elena Rodriguez was the one asking for the ride, standing beside her disabled 18-wheeler as the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reflected off the saguaro cacti and red rock formations that characterized this stretch of Interstate 10. Her truck sat silent on the shoulder, the diesel engine that had been her faithful companion for 30 years finally surrendering after hundreds of thousands of miles of faithful service across every type of terrain and weather condition that North American highways could provide. She had called for a tow truck and arranged for repairs, but the service vehicle wouldn't arrive for hours, and she had a delivery deadline in Phoenix that couldn't be missed without serious financial consequences and potential damage to her professional reputation. The pickup truck that stopped was driven by a young man who looked barely old enough to have a commercial driver's license, with the clean-cut appearance and polite demeanor that suggested good upbringing and respect for elders who might need assistance. He wore a crisp white shirt despite the desert heat, and his truck was immaculately maintained, with the kind of attention to detail that characterized people who took pride in their equipment and understood that vehicles required constant care to operate safely and reliably. "Need a lift?" he asked through the passenger window, his voice carrying the friendly helpfulness that characterized interactions between drivers who understood the challenges and vulnerabilities that came with highway travel and mechanical breakdowns that could strand even experienced professionals in remote locations far from assistance. Elena climbed into the cab, grateful for the air conditioning that provided relief from the desert heat and the opportunity to continue her journey despite the mechanical failure that had interrupted her schedule. "Phoenix! And I really appreciate this more than you know." "No problem. I'm David," the young man said, introducing himself with the casual friendliness that characterized normal social interaction between strangers who found themselves sharing transportation under emergency circumstances. He smiled and pulled back onto the interstate, with the careful attention to traffic and road conditions that suggested either recent driver training or naturally cautious personality. 30 years this December. Been driving this route since before you were born, probably, Elena said, settling back in the seat while calculating the time savings that this ride would provide and whether she could still make her delivery deadline despite the mechanical problems that had threatened to derail her schedule completely. I'm 19, driving home from college, David replied, his voice carrying the mixture of excitement and nervousness that characterized young people who were navigating the transition between adolescence and adult responsibility. It's my first semester, studying engineering at Arizona State University. Elena nodded, though something about the boy bothered her in ways she couldn't immediately articulate, creating a sense of unease that had nothing to do with his driving ability or personal conduct, but rather with subtle qualities that seemed inconsistent with normal human presence and contemporary circumstances. His truck was too clean, too perfect, showing no signs of the normal wear and accumulation of road dust that characterized vehicles used for regular highway travel, as if it had just rolled off a showroom floor, or existed in some kind of temporal bubble where normal aging and environmental exposure didn't apply. And David himself had an odd quality that made Elena question her own perception and the reliability of her senses. He was too pale, too still, carrying himself with the kind of artificial perfection that characterized photographs or museum displays, rather than living people, who breathed and moved and responded to their environment with the constant micro-judgments that characterized normal human behavior. They drove through the desert landscape as the sun disappeared behind distant mountains, leaving the vast expanse of Sonoran Desert in purple twilight that transformed familiar terrain into something mysterious and otherworldly. David was a polite passenger, asking questions about trucking operations and sharing stories about college life and his plans for an engineering career, but his responses felt rehearsed, as if he was reading from a script that had been prepared for social interaction, rather than drawing from actual personal experience and authentic emotional responses. "What's your major?" Elena asked, making the kind of conversational inquiry that helped pass time during long drives, while establishing common ground based on shared interests or experiences. "Civil engineering. I want to design bridges, maybe work on highway construction projects that improve transportation safety and efficiency," David replied with enthusiasm that seemed both genuine and somehow artificial, as if his interest in engineering was real, but his ability to pursue it existed only in theoretical rather than practical terms. "My dad says it's good, steady work. He's an engineer too, so he understands the career opportunities and challenges." Elena nodded, but she was beginning to notice details that made her question the nature of her passenger and the circumstances that had brought them together on this isolated stretch of highway. David's hands on the steering wheel were too cold and too white, lacking the normal warmth and color that characterized living human tissue, and when she looked closely, she could see through them to the dashboard underneath, as if his physical presence was somehow incomplete or existed in a different state than normal human embodiment. "David," she said carefully, choosing her words to avoid offense, while addressing the growing supernatural elements that seemed to characterize their interaction. "When did you start college?" "This fall, August 1989. It's been a great semester, but I'm ready to get home for Christmas break and spend time with family and friends," David replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who was discussing current events rather than historical circumstances that belonged to a different era entirely. Elena felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that David's temporal framework was completely disconnected from current reality and contemporary circumstances. "David, what year do you think it is?" 1989, of course. December 20th, 1989. Why would you ask such a strange question? David's response carried confusion about Elena's apparent disorientation and inability to keep track of basic temporal information that should have been obvious to anyone who is paying attention to current events and maintaining normal awareness of their circumstances. Lena looked out the window at the modern cars passing them on the interstate, the digital billboards advertising smartphones and internet services that wouldn't be invented for decades, the wind farms spinning in the distance with technology that belonged to the 21st century rather than the late 1980. Everything around them belonged to 2022, but David was experiencing reality as if more than 3 decades hadn't passed since his college semester had begun. "David, it's 2022. You've been driving for 33 years, Elena said gently, hoping to help him understand the temporal displacement that was affecting his perception without causing psychological trauma or supernatural crisis that might be dangerous for both of them. David's expression didn't change immediately, but his grip tightened on the steering wheel as he processed information that challenged every assumption he had about his current circumstances and the nature of time itself. "That's not possible. I just left school this morning after finishing my final exams. I've been looking forward to going home for weeks." "What's the last thing you remember clearly?" Elena asked, using the careful tone that people employed when helping others recover memories that might be too painful or traumatic for normal conscious awareness. David was quiet for a long moment, his silence suggesting that he was accessing memories that required considerable effort to retrieve and might contain information that was difficult to process or accept. "I was driving home for Christmas break. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., because I had stayed up studying for my last final exam. I was listening to the radio, thinking about seeing my girlfriend Sarah and giving my family the presents I'd bought for them with money I'd earned from my part-time job." His voice trailed off as he continued to access memories that were obviously becoming increasingly difficult to confront directly. "There was another car coming toward me in my lane. Drunk driver maybe, or someone who had fallen asleep at the wheel. I tried to swerve to avoid a collision, but..." "The accident was in 1989, Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer based on David's temporal confusion and the supernatural nature of their current interaction. David nodded slowly, his understanding of his own circumstances beginning to change as he processed the implications of Elena's questions and the information she was providing about current events and the passage of time. "Right here on I-10, about 10 miles east of Phoenix. I was almost home, almost at the end of my journey when everything went wrong." Elena looked around the truck's interior more carefully, noting details that confirmed her growing understanding of David's supernatural nature and the tragic circumstances that had created his ongoing presence on this highway. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see that everything was slightly wrong, existing in a temporal bubble that belonged to 1989 rather than contemporary reality. The radio was playing music from the late 1980s with the distinctive sound quality and song selection that characterized that era's popular culture. The upholstery was a style she remembered from decades ago, and even David's clothes, while clean and pressed, had the cut and fashion sensibilities that belonged to his college years rather than current styles and trends. "Why are you still driving?" Elena asked, hoping to understand the supernatural obligation or emotional attachment that had prevented David from moving on to whatever afterlife awaited college students who had died tragically young while traveling home to families who loved them and were expecting their safe arrival. "And I have to get home. My parents are expecting me for Christmas dinner. My girlfriend Sarah is waiting for me to give her the engagement ring I bought with money I saved from my part-time job." David's voice carried the desperate urgency of someone who had been traveling for 33 years without reaching his destination, driven by obligations and promises that had transcended death and continued to motivate his supernatural journey. "They're probably worried sick about me. I was supposed to be home hours ago. David, your parents, your girlfriend, they're probably..." Elena began, but she couldn't bring herself to complete the statement that would force him to confront the full implications of 33 years of separation and the likelihood that the people he was trying to reach had moved on with their lives, aged, and possibly died themselves, while he remained frozen in time as a 19-year-old college student. Don't say it. David's voice was sharp with the desperation of someone who couldn't accept realities that would make his ongoing journey meaningless and his supernatural persistence pointless. Don't tell me they're gone. I can't accept that possibility. I won't accept it. They drove in silence as the lights of Phoenix appeared in the distance, the sprawling metropolitan area that had grown dramatically since 1989, but still represented home and family and the completion of David's interrupted journey. Elena thought about all the stories she had heard over the years. Hitchhikers who couldn't let go, spirits trapped by unfinished business, souls too stubborn or too loving to accept the finality of death and move on to whatever existence awaited them beyond earthly concerns and human relationships. What if they're not waiting anymore? Elena asked gently, hoping to help David consider possibilities that might allow him to find peace without abandoning hope entirely. What if they've moved on, found peace, and are waiting for you somewhere else? Then I'll wait for them. David's jaw was set with the determination of youth, and the kind of stubborn loyalty that refused to accept that some promises couldn't be kept, and some journeys couldn't be completed. I'll keep driving this road until I find them again, until we can be reunited and continue the relationships that death interrupted. That could be forever, Eleanor observed, hoping to help him understand the potentially endless nature of his supernatural obligation and the possibility that eternal waiting might not be the best way to honor the people he loved. Then forever it is, David replied with the absolute commitment that characterized young people, who hadn't yet learned that some problems couldn't be solved through persistence and determination alone. As they approached Phoenix, Elena saw something that made her heart ache with recognition and understanding of the supernatural situation that had trapped David in decades of futile travel. In the distance, at a rest stop just off the interstate, she could see figures waiting, an older couple standing beside a 1980s sedan, holding a banner that read, "Welcome Home, David," and a young woman with big hair and clothes from another decade, clutching a wrapped present with the patience of someone who had been waiting far too long for a reunion that might never occur. "David," Elena said softly, her voice carrying the gentle firmness that characterized conversations about subjects that most people preferred to avoid. "Look over there." David followed her gaze, and his face crumpled with emotion as he recognized the figures who had been maintaining their own supernatural vigil, waiting at this rest stop for 33 years with the faith and dedication that matched his own commitment to completing his journey home. Mom? Dad? Sarah? The figures by the rest stop were translucent, barely visible in the gathering darkness, but definitely present with the kind of supernatural persistence that suggested love could indeed transcend death and maintain connections across decades of separation. But they were there, patient and loving, just as they had been every Christmas for 33 years, maintaining their own supernatural obligation to welcome home a son and boyfriend who had died trying to reach them. "They've been waiting for you," Eleanor realized, understanding that David's family had been trapped in their own supernatural loop, unable to move on because they couldn't accept that he would never arrive for the Christmas celebration they had planned together. All this time, they've been waiting and hoping that this would be the year you finally made it home. David pulled into the rest stop with movements that had become increasingly urgent as he realized that his long journey was finally approaching its conclusion, and that the people he had been trying to reach for 33 years were actually waiting for him to complete his travel home. As soon as the truck stopped, he was out the door and running toward his family, with the excitement and relief of someone who had finally found what he had been searching for across decades of supernatural travel. Elena watched through the windshield as the reunion unfolded, a Christmas homecoming that had been delayed by 33 years. But had finally become possible through supernatural persistence and the refusal of love to accept the limitations imposed by death and temporal separation. David's mother and father embraced him with the joy and relief of parents who had never stopped believing that their son would eventually find his way home, while Sarah held him with the devotion of someone who had waited decades for an engagement that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. After a few minutes of reunion and celebration, David returned to the truck where Elena was waiting, his face peaceful for the first time since she had met him. The desperate determination replaced by calm acceptance and the satisfaction of someone who had finally completed a journey that had taken far longer than anyone could have anticipated. "They've been waiting," he said, his voice carrying wonder and gratitude for the supernatural dedication that had maintained family connections across impossible spans of time. "Every Christmas, they come here and wait, hoping this will be the year I finally make it home to celebrate with them." "Are you ready now?" Elena asked, understanding that David's supernatural journey had reached a crossroads where he could choose to continue his endless travel or accept that he had finally reached his destination and could rest from decades of supernatural obligation. David nodded with the peace that comes from completing important work and fulfilling promises that had seemed impossible to keep. "I think so. I needed to know they still wanted me to come home, that I wasn't too late to join them for the Christmas we had planned together." He gathered Elena into a gentle hug that carried the gratitude of someone whose entire existence had been transformed by an act of kindness and assistance. "Thank you for helping me understand, for listening to my story and believing in the possibility that love could survive death and maintain connections across impossible distances." "What about me?" Elena asked, realizing that her own journey had been interrupted and that she still needed to reach Phoenix to complete her delivery obligations and maintain her professional reputation. "How do I get to the rest of the way?" David smiled and pointed to the highway where Elena could see her own truck pulling into the rest stop. Her familiar 18-wheeler, but somehow fixed and running smoothly, as if the mechanical problems that had stranded her had been resolved through supernatural intervention. Behind the wheel sat a figure she recognized after a moment of disbelief and wonder. It was herself, but older, more weathered, with silver hair and eyes that held the wisdom of decades spent traveling highways and learning the lessons that came from a lifetime of professional dedication and service to others. The older Elena climbed down from the cab with movements that suggested both physical aging and spiritual completion. 30 years, the older Elena said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had completed a long and meaningful career. "That's how long I've been driving professionally. Tonight's my last run, my final delivery before retirement." "But I'm not ready to retire," Elena protested, unable to accept that her trucking career might be ending just when she felt most competent and experienced, most capable of handling the challenges and responsibilities that came with professional transportation. "I know. I remember feeling that way when I was your age and in your position," the older Eleanor replied with the understanding that came from having experienced the same emotions and resistances. "But look around. Really look at what's happening here." Elena did as instructed and saw what she had been too distracted to notice during her focus on David's supernatural situation. The rest stop was full of figures. Truckers and travelers from every era, all of them translucent and obviously supernatural, all of them waiting with the patient persistence that characterized people who had found themselves trapped between destinations and unable to complete journeys that had been interrupted by death or circumstances beyond their control. She recognized some faces from years of highway travel, drivers who had died in accidents or simply faded away from the trucking community without anyone knowing exactly what had happened to them, or where they had gone when they stopped appearing at familiar truck stops and delivery locations. "This is where all the long-haul drivers end up eventually," the older Elena explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to accept supernatural realities that transcended normal understanding of career development and retirement planning. "The ones who love the road too much to leave it behind completely. We keep driving until we're ready to accept that every journey has to end somewhere." "How long have I been dead?" Elena asked, though part of her had suspected the answer since she had begun to notice the supernatural elements that characterized her interaction with David and the impossible nature of their shared journey. 3 hours. Heart attack in your truck, just like you always said you wanted when people asked about your retirement plans. Quick and clean, no hospitals or long goodbyes that would be painful for family and friends. The older Elena's voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. Your dispatcher found you at your next delivery stop. They said you looked peaceful, like someone who had died doing work they loved. Elena felt a strange sense of relief rather than fear or regret as she processed the information about her death and the supernatural nature of her current existence. No wonder David's truck had seemed so perfect and removed from contemporary reality. She had been seeing it through the eyes of someone who no longer belonged to the normal world of commercial transportation and delivery schedules. What happens now? Elena asked, curious about the choices and possibilities that awaited someone who had discovered that death didn't necessarily end all forms of meaningful activity and service to others. Now you choose, the older Elena replied, with the wisdom of someone who had already made the decision that Elena was facing. You can keep driving, keep picking up passengers who need help and assistance like you did tonight with David, or you can let someone else take over your route and move on to whatever comes next in the supernatural journey that extends beyond earthly employment. Elena looked at her truck, her faithful companion for 3 decades of highways and truck stops and lonely nights under stars that had provided both navigation and companionship during the countless miles she had traveled in service to companies and customers who had depended on her professional reliability and dedication. Then she looked at David, who was saying goodbye to his family as they prepared to leave together for whatever destination awaited college students and their families who had finally been reunited after decades of supernatural separation and waiting. Their forms were already beginning to fade as they prepared to move on to forms of existence that didn't require the constant travel and searching that had characterized their supernatural persistence. I think, Elena said slowly, making a decision that felt both inevitable and surprising. I'm ready for my last delivery, too. The older Elena smiled and climbed back into the truck that had been Elena's professional identity and primary relationship for so many years. Where to? She asked with the professional courtesy that characterized experienced drivers who understood that the most important destinations were often the ones that couldn't be found on normal maps or GPS systems. Home, whatever that means now, Elena replied, understanding that home might not be a geographical location, but rather a state of being where work was complete and rest was finally possible after decades of faithful service. As they drove away from the rest stop, Elena saw other figures beginning to gather. New drivers, fresh ghosts who weren't ready to give up the road and accept that their careers had ended. Someone would stop for them, she knew. Someone would listen to their stories and help them understand that every journey, no matter how long or how dedicated, eventually reached its destination. And that arrival was something to be celebrated rather than feared. Behind them, David and his family walked hand in hand toward a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the desert, beyond the highway, beyond the endless miles that had kept them apart for 33 years, but had finally delivered them to each other, and the Christmas reunion they had never stopped believing would eventually occur. The road stretched on forever, as it always had and always would. But for some travelers, forever was exactly as long as it needed to be to complete the journeys that mattered most and deliver the cargo that transcended commercial transportation to become gifts of love, dedication, and the understanding that some destinations were worth any amount of time and effort required to reach them. Elena's final delivery was complete, and she was going home at last, carrying with her the satisfaction of work well done and service faithfully provided to people who had needed transportation not just to geographical destinations, but to understanding, resolution, and the peace that came from completing unfinished business and honoring obligations that transcended normal employment relationships to become expressions of love and human connection. The highway phantoms had finally reached their destinations, delivered their cargo, and earned the rest that awaited all travelers who had given their best effort to journeys that sometimes took longer than anyone expected, but always arrived exactly when and where they were supposed to, carrying passengers who needed to travel distances that couldn't be measured in miles and delivering them safely to destinations that existed beyond normal maps and conventional understanding of where roads could take those who had the courage to keep driving until their work was finally done. The end. And so these stories of the highway come to a close, tales of the night shift workers who keep traveling long after their routes should have ended, passengers who need rides to destinations that exist beyond normal maps, and the understanding that some journeys continue far beyond what we might expect. Rest now, and may your own travels, whether on highways or in dreams, take you safely to wherever you need to go. Until the next story calls you back to the road, sleep well. The road to forgiveness and resolution sometimes required maintaining watch over waters that held the spirits of those who had been lost to circumstances beyond human control, continuing to provide guidance for vessels that existed in the space between memory and hope, between the obligation to protect others and the reality that some protection could never be adequate to prevent all tragedy and loss. Story 4, The Backward Walker. Danny first noticed something was wrong when he saw the hitchhiker's footprints in the mud beside Highway 78, and the impossibility of what he was observing made him slow his lumber truck and pull over, despite every instinct that told him to keep driving and avoid whatever supernatural situation was developing beside the Georgia highway. The footprints were facing the wrong direction, pointing back toward where the man had come from instead of where he was walking, creating a trail that suggested someone had been moving backward for miles while somehow navigating obstacles and terrain that should have required forward vision and normal spatial orientation. The hitchhiker himself looked normal enough from a distance, middle-aged, wearing a business suit that had seen better days, thumb extended toward the road with the patient persistence of someone who understood that help might be a long time coming on this isolated stretch of rural highway. But he was walking backward, taking careful steps without looking where he was going, as if he could see behind himself better than ahead, as if his understanding of direction and destination operated according to principles that transcended normal human navigation and spatial awareness. Danny pulled his truck over and rolled down the window, driven by curiosity and basic human concern for someone who appeared to be in distress, even if that distress manifested in ways that challenged his understanding of how people normally moved through the world. "You okay, buddy?" The man turned around, literally turned around so he was now facing forward in the conventional manner, and smiled with an expression that combined relief with something that might have been embarrassment or apology for the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. "Just need a ride. Going to Atlanta." His request was simple and straightforward, delivered with the casual tone that characterized normal interactions between strangers seeking transportation assistance, but the context made it surreal and deeply unsettling. "Car trouble?" Danny asked, making the kind of practical inquiry that usually provided context for roadside emergencies and explained how travelers had become separated from their vehicles in locations far from towns or service facilities. Something like that. The man climbed into the cab with movements that suggested both physical exhaustion and emotional relief, settling into the passenger seat with a sigh that spoke of someone who had been walking far longer than was comfortable or safe. "I've been walking for a while." His admission was delivered with the understated tone that people used when discussing difficulties they preferred not to elaborate on in detail. Danny put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, but he couldn't stop thinking about the footprints he had observed, the trail of impressions that seemed to violate basic principles of cause and effect by pointing in the wrong direction relative to the path of travel. In the side mirror, he could see the trail continuing backward along the highway shoulder, a line of evidence that suggested the man had been walking in reverse for miles without apparent difficulty or disorientation. "I'm Danny," he said, introducing himself while trying to establish normal conversational patterns that might provide some framework for understanding what he was dealing with. Martin Price." The man buckled his seatbelt and stared out the windshield with an expression that combined exhaustion with something that might have been sadness or regret. "Nice truck. How long you been driving?" His question was delivered with the kind of polite interest that characterized small talk between strangers. But Danny noticed that every few minutes, Martin would turn around in his seat and look back through the rear window, as if checking on something behind them that required constant monitoring. 15 years. "You?" Danny replied, though he was beginning to suspect that Martin's relationship with vehicles and transportation might be more complicated than normal occupational history would suggest. "I don't drive anymore, not since the accident." Martin's response provided context for his current circumstances, while raising new questions about the nature of the accident and its connection to his unusual method of locomotion and apparent inability to face forward while traveling. They drove through the Georgia countryside, past peach orchards and small towns that had grown up around agricultural development and transportation networks that connected rural communities with urban markets. Martin was a pleasant passenger, asking questions about the trucking business and sharing stories about his work in insurance, but Danny continued to notice his passenger's habit of turning around to look back through the rear window with increasing frequency and apparent anxiety. "Expecting someone?" Danny asked, hoping to understand what Martin was monitoring with such persistent attention to their back trail. "You could say that." Martin's expression grew troubled, and he pointed to the side mirror with a gesture that carried implications about pursuit and the need to maintain awareness of threats that might be following them. "I'm trying to get away from my past." "Literally?" "What do you mean?" Danny asked, though he was beginning to suspect that Martin's answer would involve circumstances that transcended normal categories of personal history and regret. Martin was quiet for a moment, then pointed to the mirror with increasing urgency. "Look behind us. Tell me what you see." Danny adjusted the mirror to get a better view of the highway behind them, and what he saw made his blood freeze and his understanding of reality shift into territories where normal causality and temporal sequence no longer applied predictably. There was another figure walking along the highway about a quarter-mile back, a man in a business suit, walking forward with normal, purposeful strides that suggested someone who knew exactly where he was going and was determined to reach his destination regardless of obstacles or delay. Even at this distance, Danny could see that the walking figure looked exactly like Martin, down to the details of clothing and posture that suggested they were the same person existing in two different states simultaneously. "Who is that?" Danny asked, his voice carrying the confusion and growing fear of someone who was witnessing phenomena that violated every assumption he had about the nature of identity and individual existence. "That's me, the me I used to be." Martin's voice was calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a mundane aspect of personal history rather than a supernatural duplication that challenged the basic principles of human consciousness and individual identity. "He's been following me for 3 years now, ever since I died." Danny's hands tightened on the wheel as the implications of Martin's statement became clear, and his passenger transformed from a normal traveler needing assistance into something that operated according to different rules about life and death and the persistence of consciousness beyond biological constraints. "You died. Car accident on Highway 78, about 50 miles back. I was driving to Atlanta for a business meeting, talking on my phone, not paying attention to the road conditions or weather patterns that were making the highway dangerous." Martin's description was delivered with the clinical detachment of someone who had analyzed his own death with the same professional thoroughness he had once applied to insurance claims and risk assessment. A head of tree doing 60 miles an hour, died instantly, according to the accident report that was filed by the state police who responded to the scene. His matter-of-fact delivery of details about his own demise created a cognitive dissonance that made Danny question his own perceptions and the nature of the conversation they were having. "But you're here. You're talking to me." Danny's protest emerged from his need to anchor their interaction in practical reality rather than supernatural territories, where the dead could continue their journeys and complete unfinished business through means that transcended normal biological limitations. Part of me is here, the part that regrets, that wants to undo what happened, that understands the magnitude of the mistake I made. Martin's explanation revealed the complex nature of his existence and the psychological processes that had created his current supernatural state. But the other part, the part that made the choice to drive recklessly, to care more about business than safety, that part is still walking toward Atlanta. Still trying to make that meeting. Danny looked in the mirror again, and the walking figure was closer now, moving with mechanical determination that suggested artificial intelligence or supernatural compulsion rather than normal human motivation. He could see the figure's face clearly. It was definitely Martin, but younger somehow, unmarked by regret or wisdom, showing none of the emotional weight that characterized the passenger sitting beside him. "If you're dead, how are you here?" Danny asked, needing some framework for understanding the supernatural mechanics that allowed consciousness to persist and travel independently of biological support systems. "Guilt splits a man in two," Martin said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned harsh truths about human nature through direct experience of consequences that most people were fortunate enough to avoid. "The part of me that knows what I did wrong is trying to get away from the part that doesn't care. I walk backward because I can't bear to see where that other me is leading us." They drove through small towns, Commerce, Gainesville, places where the highway wound through valleys and over hills that had been shaped by geological processes operating over millions of years, creating landscapes that dwarfed human concerns and made individual problems seem insignificant in the context of geological time and natural forces. But no matter how fast Danny drove, the walking figure behind them never fell back, never showed signs of fatigue or the normal limitations that affected human endurance and persistence. If anything, the figure seemed to be gaining ground, closing the distance between itself and the truck with a relentless determination of something that possessed infinite time and single-minded purpose. "He's getting closer," Danny observed, noting the supernatural figure's approach with growing unease about what might happen when the two versions of Martin were finally reunited. Martin nodded sadly, his expression carrying the resignation of someone who had been running from inevitable confrontation for 3 years without finding any resolution or escape from the supernatural circumstances that govern his existence. "He always does, eventually. I can delay him, confuse him by walking backward, but I can't outrun him forever. He has all the time in the world." "What happens when he catches up?" Danny asked, though he suspected the answer would involve some kind of supernatural resolution that would end Martin's ability to travel independently and complete whatever business had kept him moving for 3 years. "Then I have to face what I did, accept responsibility for the choice that killed me. And once I do that," Martin shrugged with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had come to terms with inevitable consequences, "I suppose I'll finally be able to rest." Danny looked in the mirror again, and the walking figure was now close enough that he could see its expression. Cold, focused, completely without remorse or self-doubt. It walked with the confidence of someone who had never questioned their own priorities or considered the possibility that business success might be less important than personal safety and the welfare of other people who shared the highways. "Why don't you want to face him?" Danny asked, trying to understand the psychological dynamics that kept Martin running from a confrontation that seemed inevitable and potentially beneficial. "Because he'll make me remember why I was driving so fast that day," why that business meeting seemed more important than driving safely. Martin's voice grew quiet as he accessed memories that were obviously painful and difficult to confront directly. I was having an affair. The meeting in Atlanta was a cover story. I was rushing to see my girlfriend, lying to my wife about where I was going and why the trip was necessary. The walking figure was now only a few hundred yards behind them, close enough that Danny could see it wasn't quite human in its movements and expressions. Its movements were too precise, too mechanical, like a wind-up toy that had been programmed with a single purpose and would continue operating until its spring ran down or some external force interrupted its function. My wife was pregnant with our first child, Martin continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent 3 years contemplating the full implications of choices made in moments of selfishness and poor judgment. I was going to leave her after the baby was born, start a new life with someone younger, more exciting. The old Martin, the one back there, he thought he was so clever, so entitled to happiness, regardless of the cost to other people. But you don't feel that way anymore? Danny asked, trying to understand how death and supernatural existence had changed Martin's perspective on the choices that had led to his current circumstances. Death has a way of clarifying your priorities. When I saw my wife at the funeral, 8 months pregnant and devastated by losing someone she had trusted completely, I realized what I'd almost thrown away. What I did throw away. Martin turned to look at Danny with eyes that held 3 years of accumulated regret and understanding. She named the baby Martine after me. He's 3 years old now. I've been trying to get back to them, but that other me won't let me rest until I acknowledge what we did. The walking figure was now alongside the truck, matching their speed with impossible strides that covered ground more quickly than normal human locomotion should have allowed. Danny could see its face clearly in the side mirror. Martin's face, but empty of emotion or conscience, showing none of the pain and wisdom that characterized the passenger beside him. "He's here," Danny said, stating the obvious while feeling helpless to prevent whatever supernatural confrontation was about to take place between the two versions of Martin Price. Martin turned to look at his other self for the first time since Danny had picked him up, and the gesture seemed to require enormous effort, as if facing forward instead of backward represented a fundamental change in his supernatural existence. "I know." The walking figure reached out and touched the passenger door with movements that seemed to drain energy from the truck's electrical systems, and instantly the vehicle began to slow, despite Danny's pressure on the accelerator. The engine continued running, but the truck decelerated until it rolled to a stop on the shoulder of the highway, as if the supernatural contact had interrupted the normal relationship between mechanical input and forward motion. "This is it," Martin said, gathering himself to leave the truck and confront the version of himself that had been pursuing him for 3 years through the supernatural landscape of unresolved guilt and moral consequence. He opened the door and stepped down from the cab, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who was about to face the most difficult conversation of his existence. The walking figure was waiting for him on the roadside, standing perfectly still with arms at its sides, staring at Martin with those empty eyes that seemed to reflect no recognition of moral complexity or emotional consequence. "Hello," Martin said to his other self, his voice carrying both resignation and determination. "I suppose it's time we had a talk." The walking figure nodded once, then stepped forward with movements that seemed to merge reality with memory, and as the two Martins touched, they began to merge like two photographs being overlapped and double exposed. For a moment, Danny could see both versions simultaneously, the regretful Martin and the callous one, struggling for dominance in a single form that contained all the contradictions and complexities of human moral development. Then there was only one man standing beside the truck, looking like Martin but complete somehow, whole in a way he hadn't been before when split between regret and selfishness. He had integrated both versions of himself into a single consciousness that could acknowledge past mistakes while accepting responsibility for choices that couldn't be changed through supernatural intervention or temporal manipulation. "Thank you for the ride," he said to Danny, his voice carrying a peace that had been absent during their journey together. "I can find my own way from here." "Where will you go?" Danny asked, curious about Martin's destination, now that he had been reunited with the aspects of himself that he had been avoiding for 3 years. Martin smiled, and for the first time the expression reached his eyes, and created an appearance of genuine contentment and resolution. "Home. To see my wife and son. To tell them I'm sorry. And then I think I'll finally be able to rest." He walked away from the truck, heading not toward Atlanta and the business meeting that had caused his death, but back the way they'd come, toward home and family, and the possibility of forgiveness that existed beyond the reach of normal human communication, but might still be accessible through supernatural means. His footprints in the soft earth faced forward now, pointing toward home and redemption, rather than business obligations and selfish pursuits. Danny sat in his truck for a long time, watching Martin disappear into the distance as he made his way toward whatever resolution was possible for someone who had spent 3 years learning to integrate the different aspects of his character and moral development. When he finally drove away, he checked his mirrors constantly. But the highway behind him was empty of supernatural figures and impossible footprints. The next week, Danny read about a woman in Lawrenceville who claimed her dead husband had visited her in a dream, appearing to her and their 3-year-old son with apologies for his mistakes and declarations of love that transcended normal categories of communication between the living and the dead. Margaret Price said Martin had appeared to her during the night, speaking words of forgiveness and understanding that had brought her peace after 3 years of struggling with grief and unanswered questions about his final months and the circumstances that had led to his death. She'd woken to find fresh flowers on her nightstand, flowers that matched those from their wedding bouquet, arrangements that couldn't have been obtained through normal commercial sources but seemed to have been gathered from places that existed beyond normal geographical boundaries. The strange thing was, the flowers were still fresh when police investigated the reported supernatural visitation, though they'd apparently been picked from a cemetery 50 miles away where Martin Price was buried. Some journeys, Danny learned, required travelers to face the worst parts of themselves before they could reach their destinations, to integrate aspects of their personality that they had been avoiding or denying before they could find the peace that came with complete self-acknowledge and moral clarity. And sometimes, the longest distance between 2 points was the path from guilt to forgiveness, from self-deception to honest acknowledgement of choices that had created consequences extending far beyond individual lives and affecting families and communities in ways that required supernatural intervention to resolve. The backward walker had finally learned to face forward, to move toward home and healing rather than away from responsibility and consequence, completing a journey that had taken 3 years of supernatural travel through landscapes where different rules applied to time and space, and the possibility of redemption for those who were willing to confront the full truth about their choices and their impact on others. Story 5, The Delivery Man. The man flagging down Jerry's truck wore a brown uniform that looked like it belonged to a package delivery service. But there was something indefinably wrong about both the uniform and the situation that made Jerry slow his food service truck and approach with the caution that came from 30 years of highway driving and encounters with situations that didn't fit normal patterns of roadside assistance and commercial transportation. The company logo on the uniform was faded beyond recognition, weathered by time and exposure until it was impossible to determine which delivery service the man represented, and there was no vehicle in sight that would explain how a delivery driver had become stranded beside Interstate 81 in the Virginia mountains during the deep hours of the night. He stood beside what appeared to be a broken-down van on the shoulder of the highway, waving frantically as 18-wheelers roared past in the darkness. Their drivers focused on schedules and destinations that didn't allow for extended stops to assist strangers whose circumstances might represent complications or delays. But something about the man's desperation and professional appearance prompted Jerry to pull over despite the late hour and his own tight delivery schedule, driven by the solidarity that connected people who worked in transportation and logistics and understood how quickly mechanical problems could transform routine business trips into emergency situations requiring assistance from fellow professionals. "Thanks for stopping," the man said as Jerry climbed down from his cab, his voice carrying the grateful relief of someone who had been waiting longer than was comfortable for help that might not have materialized without Jerry's intervention. "Name's Frank Morrison. My van's dead and I've got packages that absolutely have to be delivered today." His introduction was brief and professional, focusing on the practical problems that had brought them together, rather than personal details that might not be relevant to the immediate situation. Jerry looked at the van more carefully, noting details that increased his sense that something about this situation didn't follow normal patterns of commercial vehicle breakdown and roadside assistance. It was old, probably from the 1990s, with rust-eating holes in the panels and windows, so clouded with age and weathering that he couldn't see inside to assess the nature or quantity of cargo that Frank claimed was so urgently needed for delivery. The vehicle had the desolate appearance of equipment that had been abandoned for years, rather than recently disabled by mechanical failure. "What kind of packages?" Jerry asked, making the kind of practical inquiry that helped establish the scope of assistance that might be required and the resources that would be needed to resolve Frank's transportation problem. "Important ones. Life-changing ones." Frank walked to the back of the van and opened the rear doors with movements that suggested both familiarity with the vehicle and pride in the cargo it contained. Inside, Jerry could see dozens of packages in various sizes, all wrapped in brown paper and tied with string in the old-fashioned manner that belonged to earlier eras of package delivery, when presentation and careful handling were considered as important as speed and efficiency. But the packages looked wrong somehow, creating optical effects that made Jerry question his own perception and the reliability of his senses. They seemed to shift and move when he wasn't looking directly at them, creating the impression that the contents were alive or restless, requiring constant attention and careful handling to prevent damage or escape. "I can take you to the next town," Jerry offered, providing the kind of assistance that one professional driver normally extended to another when mechanical problems created transportation emergencies. "Get you to a phone, call for a tow truck, and arrange for alternative delivery methods." "No time for that." Frank selected a small package from the van with movements that suggested careful consideration and intimate knowledge of his cargo's specific requirements and destinations. "These need to be delivered today, or people will miss their chances, their opportunities." His voice carried an urgency that transcended normal commercial delivery schedules, suggesting that the packages represented more than simple commercial transactions or routine business correspondence. Jerry frowned, trying to understand what kind of delivery service operated according to schedules so critical that missing a single day would result in permanent loss of opportunity for the intended recipients. Chances for what? Love, success, redemption. All the things people are waiting for without knowing it. Frank cradled the package carefully, handling it with the reverence that people normally reserved for religious artifacts or objects with supernatural significance. "I've been making these deliveries for a long time. Can't stop now." Despite his better judgment and every practical consideration that argued against becoming involved in circumstances he didn't understand, Jerry found himself agreeing to help Frank complete his deliveries. There was something about the man's dedication and the mysterious nature of his cargo that appealed to Jerry's sense of curiosity and his natural inclination to assist fellow professionals who were dealing with work emergencies that threatened to disrupt important business operations. Frank climbed into the passenger seat with 3 packages selected from his van's cargo, giving Jerry addresses for houses scattered throughout the Shenandoah Valley, destinations that would require several hours of driving through rural territory where farms and small communities were connected by winding roads that followed the natural contours of the landscape rather than the efficient straight lines preferred by highway engineers. The first delivery was to a farmhouse outside Staunton, a modest structure surrounded by fields and outbuildings that spoke of agricultural operations that had been maintained by the same family for generations. Frank walked up to the door with his small package, knocked once with the professional courtesy that characterized experienced delivery personnel, and handed the package to the elderly woman, who answered with an expression of surprise that quickly transformed into joy and tears of gratitude. "What did you give her?" Jerry asked when Frank returned to the truck, his curiosity driven by the dramatic emotional response that a simple package delivery had generated in someone who had clearly not been expecting to receive anything. A letter from her son. He's been meaning to write for 3 years, ever since their argument about his choice of career and lifestyle. Tonight, he'll finally find the courage to pick up a pen and express the feelings he's been carrying. Frank's explanation revealed both the supernatural nature of his delivery service and his ability to anticipate future events and human behavior with precision that transcended normal predictive capabilities. "How do you know?" Jerry asked, though he suspected the answer would involve supernatural knowledge and abilities that operated according to different principles than normal human understanding of cause and effect. Frank smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had found meaningful work that provided both purpose and fulfillment despite operating outside normal categories of employment and commercial activity. "Because I deliver what people need when they need it most. It's my job." The second delivery was to a small house in Harrisonburg, where Frank carried a larger package, rectangular and flat like a portfolio or document folder. The young man who answered the door looked skeptical at first, examining Frank's uniform and credentials with the caution that characterized people who had learned to be suspicious of unexpected visitors and unsolicited delivery. But when Frank handed him the package and he saw its contents, tears began streaming down his face with the sudden release of emotion that comes from receiving exactly what is needed at the moment when hope has almost been exhausted. "What was that one?" Jerry asked as they returned to the truck, fascinated by Frank's ability to create dramatic, positive changes in people's lives through the simple act of delivering packages that seemed to contain exactly what each recipient needed most: a job application. He's been unemployed for 8 months, too depressed and discouraged to even try looking for work. That package contains the application for his dream job, one he would have missed if he'd waited another day to submit his qualifications. Frank's description revealed his role as a facilitator of positive change and opportunity, someone who helped people overcome obstacles and seize chances that might otherwise be lost to timing or circumstance. The third delivery was to an apartment complex in Waynesboro, where Frank carried the smallest package. No bigger than a jewelry box, but handled with the same careful attention that characterized all of his deliveries. The woman who answered the door was middle-aged, with the worn look of someone who had given up on hope and learned to expect disappointment rather than positive surprises from life. But when she saw the package, her expression transformed, with the kind of wonder and joy that comes from receiving something precious that had been thought lost forever. "And that one?" Jerry asked, completing his inquiry about the 3 deliveries they had made together. "A key," Frank said simply, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had completed important work that would have lasting positive impact on someone's life. "To a storage unit her late husband rented before he died. Inside she'll find letters he wrote to her over 20 years of marriage. Love letters he was too shy to give her while he was alive. Expressions of devotion that will help her understand how much she was cherished and valued." Jerry was beginning to understand that Frank operated according to principles that transcended normal commercial delivery services, functioning as some kind of supernatural facilitator who helped people receive what they needed most at precisely the moment when intervention could create the greatest positive impact. Who decides what gets delivered? The universe, I suppose. Or fate, or just the accumulated weight of human longing and need. Frank checked his clipboard, which seemed to contain endless addresses written in fading ink that suggested the list had been compiled over many years of supernatural delivery operations. People send out wishes all the time, most of them unconsciously. They wish for second chances, for love, for forgiveness, for opportunities to make amends or start over. I deliver what they need to make those wishes come true. But you said your van broke down, Jerry observed, trying to understand how Frank's supernatural delivery service had been interrupted by mechanical problems that seemed mundane compared to the miraculous nature of his cargo and mission. Frank's expression grew troubled, taking on the appearance of someone who was dealing with changes and limitations that threatened work he considered essential and meaningful. It's been happening more often lately. The van breaking down, packages going undelivered, people missing their opportunities because I can't reach them in time. I think my time is almost up. Your time? Jerry asked, though he suspected the answer would involve supernatural schedules and obligations that operated according to different principles than normal human employment and career development. I've been doing this job for 37 years, ever since I died. Frank's admission transformed their conversation from practical discussion about delivery services into something that required acceptance of supernatural realities and the possibility that death didn't necessarily end all forms of meaningful work and service to others. Jerry felt his hands tighten on the wheel as the implications of Frank's statement became clear, and his passenger revealed himself to be something other than a normal delivery driver dealing with routine mechanical problems. Died? Heart attack at age 43, right there on Interstate 81, about 20 miles from where you picked me up. I was a real delivery driver then, working for a legitimate package service, trying to make quota before the end of the month and maintain the kind of productivity standards that kept me employed in a competitive industry. Frank stared out the window at the Virginia countryside, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades contemplating the circumstances that had led to his death and subsequent supernatural employment. I had a heart attack while driving, crashed into the median barrier, and died instantly. But there were packages in my van, important packages that people were depending on to receive on schedule. Frank's description revealed both the circumstances of his death and the supernatural obligation that had prevented him from moving on to whatever afterlife awaited delivery drivers who had completed their earthly employment. A birthday gift from a father to his estranged daughter, their first communication in 5 years after a family argument that had created seemingly permanent separation. Medical supplies for a diabetic who was running out of insulin and couldn't afford to refill his prescription through normal channels. A contract that would save a small business from bankruptcy and preserve the livelihoods of a dozen employees who depended on that company for their survival. What happened to them? Jerry asked, though he suspected the answer would involve tragedy and missed opportunities that had created the supernatural obligation Frank had been fulfilling for 37 years. They went undelivered. The father and daughter never reconciled, dying years later without ever resolving their differences or rebuilding their relationship. The diabetic had to be hospitalized when his blood sugar reached dangerous levels, creating medical bills that bankrupted his family. The business failed when the contract arrived too late, putting good people out of work during a recession when finding new employment was nearly impossible. Frank's voice was heavy with guilt that had accumulated over decades of contemplating the consequences of his death and the packages that had never reached their intended recipients. All because I was pushing too hard, working too many hours, ignoring my health and the warning signs that should have prompted me to seek medical attention before my condition became fatal. His acknowledgement of responsibility revealed both the source of his supernatural obligation and the dedication that had kept him making deliveries for 37 years beyond his natural lifespan. Jerry looked at Frank more carefully, noting details that confirmed his supernatural nature. The slight translucency that made him appear like a double-exposed photograph. The way his uniform seemed to belong to an earlier era of delivery services. The fact that his van had been abandoned for years despite his claims about ongoing delivery operations. "So you kept delivering packages?" Jerry asked, trying to understand the supernatural mechanics that allowed consciousness to persist beyond death and continue meaningful work that benefited living people. "Someone had to. Death doesn't stop the mail, doesn't cancel people's need for hope and connection, and the opportunities that can transform their lives." Frank's explanation revealed both his dedication to service and his understanding of the role that package delivery played in maintaining human connections and facilitating positive change. "So I kept working, delivering the packages that matter most, the ones that carry dreams and second chances and the possibility of redemption." They made 17 more deliveries that afternoon, each one bringing light to someone's darkness and creating opportunities for positive change that wouldn't have existed without Frank's supernatural intervention. A wedding ring to a man who had lost hope of finding love after a series of failed relationships, a scholarship letter to a student who couldn't afford college education through conventional means, a medical test result that would ease a mother's fears about her child's health and allow their family to plan for a future that seemed secure rather than threatened. But with each delivery, Frank seemed to fade a little more, becoming increasingly translucent, as if the act of completing his supernatural mission was somehow diminishing his ability to maintain physical presence in the world of the living. By evening, Jerry could barely see him in the passenger seat, his form becoming as insubstantial as morning mist. "This is the last one," Frank said, holding a package that was addressed to Jerry himself, creating a situation that challenged Jerry's understanding of his role in Frank's supernatural delivery service. "For me?" Jerry asked, uncertain how he had become a recipient rather than simply an assistant in Frank's mission to help people receive what they needed most. "Open it." Frank's instruction was delivered with the gentle authority of someone who knew exactly what needed to happen and was confident that the contents would prove beneficial to the recipient. Inside the package was a photograph. Jerry's own family, his wife and 2 kids, taken at last year's Christmas party in a pose that Jerry didn't remember arranging or participating in. But it wasn't a photo he had taken or that existed in his personal collection. In the picture, his family was looking directly at the camera with expressions of pure love and concern that seemed to carry a message he needed to understand. "They miss you," Frank said, his voice becoming fainter as his form continued to fade toward complete invisibility. "You've been working too much, spending too many hours on the road and not enough time with the people who matter most. Your daughter asked your wife last week if Daddy still loves them because you've been absent from so many important family events." Jerry felt tears in his eyes as he recognized the truth in Frank's observation and understood how his dedication to work had created distance from the people he was working to support. He had been taking extra shifts and longer routes to earn more money, telling himself it was for his family's benefit while missing dinners, bedtime stories, and the daily interactions that created strong family bonds and emotional security for children who needed consistent parental presence. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Jerry asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer and understood what choice Frank was encouraging him to make. "Go home. Tonight. Not next week when this load is delivered, not when your schedule permits, but tonight." Frank was barely visible now, just a shadow in the passenger seat that spoke with the wisdom of someone who had learned too late about the importance of prioritizing family relationships over professional obligations. Some deliveries can wait, but love can't. Jerry pulled over at the next exit and called his dispatcher, making a decision that violated company policy but honored the more important obligations that connected him to his wife and children. For the first time in his career, he abandoned a load before completion, arranging for another driver to take over his route so he could return home to family members who needed his presence more than his paycheck. When he reached home 3 hours later, his family was waiting with the kind of excitement and relief that suggested they had been hoping for exactly this kind of surprise arrival. His wife had made his favorite dinner despite the late hour, and his kids had drawn pictures to welcome him home, creating an evening of connection and communication that reminded him why family relationships required constant attention and nurturing, rather than being taken for granted as stable resources that would always be available, regardless of how much time he spent away from home. The next morning, Jerry read about a discovery on Interstate 81 that made him understand the full scope of Frank's supernatural service and the decades he had spent trying to complete deliveries that had been interrupted by his untimely death. A delivery van from the 1980S had been found in a ravine where it had apparently crashed decades earlier, containing the skeletal remains of Frank Morrison and dozens of packages that had never reached their intended recipients. But the strange thing was that several people in the Shenandoah Valley reported receiving unexpected packages that same day, deliveries that brought them exactly what they needed most, carried by a man in a brown uniform who vanished before they could thank him properly. The packages contained opportunities and connections that transformed lives and created the kind of positive changes that rippled through families and communities for generations. Jerry kept the photograph Frank had given him on his dashboard as a reminder that the most important deliveries weren't measured in miles or money, but in moments spent with the people who mattered most and the connections that made life worth living. Some jobs were too important to abandon, even in death, but the most essential delivery of all was the daily gift of presence and attention that families needed to thrive and maintain the bonds that sustained them through difficult times and changing circumstances. Frank Morrison had finally completed his route and delivered his final package, but his legacy continued in the lives he had touched. And the road was full of unfinished business and unpaid debts, Elena realized. But some of those debts belonged to the universe rather than the individuals who carried them, and some business would remain unfinished no matter how many times people tried to complete it. Sarah Martinez would keep making her journey until she learned to forgive herself for arriving too late, until she understood that some tragedies were beyond human prevention and that her dedication was more important than her success or failure in any particular case. Story 6. The Burning Road. The man walking along Highway 61 was on fire, but he didn't seem to notice, and the wrongness of that disconnection between his blazing condition and his casual demeanor made Rita slow her refrigerated truck and pull over, despite every instinct that told her to keep driving and avoid whatever impossible situation was developing beside the Mississippi Highway. Flames licked at his clothes and hair, casting dancing shadows on the asphalt that moved independently of any wind or atmospheric disturbance. But he continued his steady pace with his thumb extended toward the road, as if being on fire was no more remarkable than wearing a hat or carrying a briefcase. Rita had been driving nights for 15 years, hauling produce from California to the East Coast, along routes that took her through every kind of weather and road condition. And she'd seen plenty of strange things on the highway, accidents that defied explanation, breakdowns that revealed mechanical failures that shouldn't have been possible, people in various states of distress who needed assistance that went beyond normal roadside aid, but she'd never seen anyone literally burning while trying to hitchhike, maintaining normal human behavior while experiencing what should have been agonizing and immediately fatal combustion. She pulled her truck over and grabbed the fire extinguisher from behind her seat, driven by practical concern and basic human compassion that overrode her growing sense that normal firefighting equipment might not be adequate for whatever was happening to the man beside the highway. But as she approached him, carrying the extinguisher and preparing to address what appeared to be a serious emergency, the flames seemed to shift and waver like heat mirages, there one moment and gone the next, creating an optical effect that challenged her understanding of how fire was supposed to behave. "Sir, are you—" She stopped mid-sentence, her practical question dying in her throat as she got close enough to see that the man looked completely normal, despite the apparent combustion that surrounded him. Middle-aged, wearing jeans and a work shirt that showed no signs of burning or heat damage. No evidence of the kind of trauma that should have resulted from being engulfed in flames, but the air around him shimmered with heat distortion, creating visual effects that made the space near his body appear to bend and twist, and she could swear she smelled smoke, despite the absence of any visible source for combustion. "I need a ride," the man said, his voice calm and ordinary, carrying no indication of distress or awareness that anything unusual was happening to him or around him. "Heading south?" His request was simple and straightforward, delivered with the casual tone that characterized normal interactions between strangers seeking transportation assistance, but the context made it surreal and deeply unsettling. Rita looked him over carefully, searching for signs of injury or evidence that would explain the visual phenomena she was witnessing. No burns, no singed clothing, no indication that he was experiencing the kind of medical emergency that would normally accompany being on fire. But her skin prickled with the sensation of standing too close to a campfire, and the air near him carried the dry heat that characterized intense thermal radiation. "You feeling all right? You look warm." Her question emerged from the need to address what she was observing without sounding crazy or making accusations that might prove embarrassing if she was misinterpreting normal situations through the lens of fatigue or highway hypnosis. The man smiled, and for just a moment Rita saw flames behind his eyes. Not metaphorical heat or anger, but actual fire that flickered and danced as if his skull contained a furnace rather than normal human consciousness. "I run a little hot. Always have." The casual acknowledgement of his condition was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone that people used when discussing minor personal quirks or harmless eccentricities. Against her better judgment, influenced by years of providing assistance to stranded travelers and her natural inclination to help people who needed transportation, she led him into the cab. The temperature inside the truck immediately rose 10 degrees despite the air conditioning running at full capacity, and the climate control system began struggling to maintain comfortable conditions, as if it were working against a heat source that operated according to different principles than normal thermal dynamics. The man settled into the passenger seat, and Rita noticed the vinyl began to bubble slightly where he touched it, creating small blisters in the upholstery that suggested direct contact with temperatures that exceeded the material's tolerance levels. But he seemed unaware of the effect he was having on his surroundings, settling in with the relaxed posture of someone who was grateful for the ride and ready to engage in normal passenger conversation. "Name's Carl," he said, introducing himself with the casual friendliness that characterized interactions between strangers who found themselves sharing transportation during long highway journeys. "Carl Weber." "Rita." "Where you headed, Carl?" She pulled back onto the highway, feeling the familiar weight of her refrigerated cargo and noting that the temperature gauges were beginning to show stress from the unusual thermal load that Carl's presence was placing on her truck's cooling systems. "Greenwood, you know it?" The destination was familiar to Rita, a small town in Mississippi about 4 hours south where she had made deliveries to distribution centers that served rural communities throughout the region. Rita nodded, confirming her familiarity with the destination while monitoring the truck's temperature gauges and wondering how long her cooling systems could continue functioning under the current thermal stress. "I'm heading that direction anyway, delivering to a distribution center in Jackson." They drove through the Arkansas Delta, past cotton fields and catfish farms that stretched toward distant horizons under an enormous sky that seemed to dwarf human activities and make individual concerns seem insignificant in the context of agricultural cycles and geological time. Carl was a quiet passenger, staring out the windshield with an expression of distant concentration. But the temperature in the cab kept climbing despite the air conditioning running at maximum capacity, and Rita found herself sweating in the driver's seat despite wearing light clothing appropriate for summer driving. "You sure you're feeling okay?" she asked, her concern growing as the thermal conditions in the cab became increasingly uncomfortable and potentially dangerous for both her driving ability and the integrity of her cargo. "You're putting off some serious heat." Carl turned to look at her, and she saw that strange flicker again, flames dancing just beneath his skin, as if his entire body contained fire that was struggling to break through normal human tissue barriers. "I've been burning for a long time," he said, his voice carrying matter-of-fact acceptance of his condition. "Can't seem to put it out." Burning? Rita's question carried implications about both literal combustion and metaphorical meanings that might explain his supernatural condition and his apparent acceptance of circumstances that should have been causing extreme distress. Started 15 years ago, July 4th, 1987. I was working late at the chemical plant in Greenwood, trying to finish up before the holiday weekend so I could spend time with my family. Carl's voice took on the narrative quality of someone who had told this story many times, either to himself or to others who had been willing to listen to explanations that transcended normal categories of workplace accidents and industrial safety. "There was an accident, a pipe burst, sprayed me with something that wasn't supposed to mix with oxygen." Carl's description was delivered with the calm detachment of someone discussing events that had happened to someone else. But Rita could see the flames becoming more visible as he spoke, crawling up his arms and across his chest with increasing intensity. "I caught fire right there on the factory floor. Burned to death while my coworkers watched and tried to help." Rita felt her hands tighten on the wheel as the implications of his statement became clear, and the temperature gauge on her dashboard climbed toward the red zone that indicated potential engine failure. "That's terrible. How badly were you burned?" "Completely." Carl smiled again, and this time Rita definitely saw flames, not just behind his eyes, but emerging from his mouth as if his entire respiratory system had become a combustion chamber. "Burned to death right there in the plant. Took the fire department 3 hours to put out the blaze and recover what was left of my body." The cab was stifling now, the temperature gauge deep in the red zone that indicated imminent mechanical failure, and Rita could feel heat through the floorboards that suggested the truck's cooling systems were being overwhelmed by thermal loads they hadn't been designed to handle. She could smell something burning, not smoke exactly, but the sharp chemical odor of overheated metal and melting plastic that indicated mechanical components were beginning to fail under extreme condition. "Carl," she said carefully, trying to maintain calm while processing information that challenged her understanding of life and death and the boundaries between physical reality and supernatural phenomena. "If you died in 1987, what are you doing here?" "Going home." He gestured toward the windshield, indicating their direction of travel and his intended destination. "The plant's been closed since the accident. Contaminated, they said. Too dangerous to clean up. But I still work there, still trying to finish my shift." Rita wanted to pull over, wanted to get out of the truck and away from this man who radiated impossible heat while claiming to be dead, but they were in the middle of nowhere, with cotton fields stretching to the horizon and no place to run that would provide safety or assistance from authorities who might understand supernatural emergencies. "Why don't you rest?" she asked, hoping that normal human needs like sleep might still apply to whatever Carl had become. "Stop working?" Carl's expression grew sad, carrying the weight of someone who had been struggling with impossible circumstances for 15 years without finding resolution or peace. "Can't. The fire won't let me. Every night I walk back to the plant, try to shut off the valve that burst, but I can never reach it in time. The fire always starts before I can fix it." As he spoke, the flames became fully visible, no longer flickering glimpses, but steady combustion that crawled across his body without consuming his clothes or causing apparent pain. But instead of destroying him, the fire seemed to emerge from within, glowing through his skin like he was a lantern with a candle inside, illuminating him from the inside out with supernatural radiance. The truck's engine was overheating now, the cooling system overwhelmed by the thermal load that Carl's presence was placing on mechanical systems that had been designed for normal cargo transport rather than supernatural passengers who generated their own heat sources. Rita could see steam beginning to rise from the hood, and warning lights were flashing across her dashboard like a Christmas tree of mechanical distress. "Carl, you're going to burn up my truck," she said, her practical concerns about vehicle maintenance and cargo protection overriding her fear of offending someone who might not be entirely human. "I'm sorry." He looked genuinely distressed, his expression carrying the guilt of someone who understood that his condition created problems for other people, but couldn't control the supernatural forces that governed his existence. "I can't control it anymore. The fire has its own will now." They limped into Greenwood as the sun was setting, the truck's cooling system barely functional and mechanical components operating at temperatures that exceeded their design specifications. Carl directed her through the industrial district, past empty warehouses and abandoned lots that spoke of economic decline and industrial decay, until they reached a chain-link fence surrounding a blackened concrete pad where a building had once stood. "This is it," Carl said, indicating the empty lot that had once housed the chemical plant where he had died 15 years earlier. "Home." Rita pulled over, noting that the truck's engine was making sounds that suggested expensive repairs would be needed before she could continue her journey, and Carl gathered himself to leave with the careful attention of someone who had performed the same actions countless times. As he opened the door, superheated air rushed out of the cab like opening an oven, carrying temperatures that made breathing difficult and created immediate perspiration despite the evening air outside. "Thank you," he said, his gratitude genuine despite the mechanical damage his presence had caused. "Most people won't stop when they see the fire." "What happens now?" Rita asked, curious about his nightly routine and the supernatural obligation that kept him returning to a workplace that no longer existed in any form that could provide employment or purpose. "I go to work, try again to shut off that valve. Maybe tonight I'll be fast enough." He smiled sadly, carrying the hope of someone who had been disappointed countless times but couldn't abandon the possibility that persistence might eventually lead to success. "Probably not, though. I never am." Carl walked toward the fence, and as he did, flames erupted around him in earnest. Not the flickering heat mirages Rita had seen before, but real fire. Bright orange and hungry, consuming the air around him without damaging his clothes or causing apparent pain. He passed through the chain link like it wasn't there, leaving molten metal in his wake that glowed red-hot in the gathering darkness. Rita watched him walk across the empty lot toward something only he could see. Invisible machinery, phantom chemicals, a workplace that existed only in the moment of his death, and the supernatural obligation that kept him returning to complete tasks that could never be finished. As he reached the center of the lot, the fire consumed him completely, creating a pillar of flame against the darkening sky that burned with supernatural intensity before suddenly extinguishing, leaving only darkness and the smell of smoke. Rita's truck took 2 hours to cool down enough to restart, the cooling system damaged by temperatures that should have been impossible inside a passenger compartment designed for human comfort rather than supernatural heat sources. When she finally made it to a service station, the mechanic told her the damage was consistent with exposure to extreme heat, temperatures that should have been fatal to anyone inside the vehicle. "What were you hauling?" he asked, examining the melted plastic and warped metal that characterized her truck's interior. Molten steel? Rita never told him about Carl Weber and the supernatural fire that had marked her truck with evidence of temperatures that belonged to industrial furnaces rather than highway transportation. But she looked up the accident at the Greenwood chemical plant, finding the story in local newspaper archives and historical records that documented one of the worst industrial disasters in Mississippi history. The massive chemical fire that had killed Carl Weber, 34, who had died trying to shut off a ruptured chemical line while his co-workers evacuated to safety. The plant had been demolished 6 months later, the contaminated site declared too dangerous for cleanup or redevelopment. But according to the security guard Rita talked to, the lot wasn't really empty. Wasn't really abandoned in the way that normal vacant industrial sites remained unused and forgotten. Every night around sunset, there were reports of fire on the property. Not the kind of brush fires or vagrant activity that sometimes occurred at abandoned sites, but something that looked like a person walking around in the flames, trying to fix equipment that no longer existed. Strangest thing, the guard said, his voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone who had witnessed phenomena that challenged his understanding of how the world was supposed to work. Looks like a man walking around in there, trying to fix something. Always ends the same way, though. Fire gets him every time. Vita drove different routes after that, avoiding Highway 61 and the industrial districts of small towns where supernatural obligations might trap the dead in cycles of endless repetition. But sometimes, on hot summer nights when the air shimmered with heat and the horizon wavered like a mirage, she would think about Carl Weber and his nightly journey to a workplace that existed only in memory and supernatural obligation. Still punching a time clock that no longer existed, still trying to prevent an accident that had happened 15 years ago, still burning with the fire that had killed him while carrying his death like a torch he could never set down. Some people, Rita learned, were too dedicated to quit their jobs, even when quitting was the only escape from an endless fiery hell that consumed them nightly without providing the release of final death. The dedication that made someone a good worker, the sense of responsibility, the commitment to completing assigned tasks, the professional pride that came from doing important work well, these qualities could apparently survive even death, creating obligations that transcended normal employment relationships and continued long after paychecks stopped and retirement benefits became irrelevant. Story 7. The Dark Passenger. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years, and if there's one thing I've learned during my countless journeys across America's vast highway system, it's that the open road can hide more than just potholes and wandering deer. Sometimes it conceals dark secrets that are better left undiscovered, and occasionally it brings you face to face with passengers you never intended to pick up. My story takes place on a particularly warm summer night along Interstate 10, a route I've traveled countless times without incident, stretching across Texas like a concrete river, carrying commerce and dreams from Houston to Los Angeles. It was an uneventful drive by all accounts, or so I thought, as I settled in for the long haul, with a load of electronics secured safely in my trailer. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, feeling the familiar weight of fatigue settling over me like a heavy blanket, I decided to stop at a rest area near a small town whose name I can't even remember now. I pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, noting how the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting shadows across the cracked asphalt that seemed to move with a life of their own. As I stepped out of my rig and stretched my legs, breathing in the thick night air that carried the mingled scents of diesel fuel and blooming wildflowers, I noticed a woman standing near the edge of the lot. She appeared disheveled and wore a faded dress that fluttered gently in the warm breeze, her hair hanging down in messy waves that obscured most of her face from view. Something about her presence made my skin crawl with an inexplicable unease, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she might genuinely need help. The isolation of the rest area, combined with a late hour, made her situation seem potentially dangerous for a woman alone. "Hey there," I called out, trying to sound as friendly and non-threatening as possible. "Are you okay? Do you need any assistance?" She turned slowly to face me, and I felt an immediate chill run down my spine like ice water. Her eyes were wide and glassy, almost as if she were in some kind of trance or under the influence of something powerful. "I'm lost," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of insects chirping in the darkness. "I don't know where I am or how I got here." Everything seemed so confused and unclear. I took a tentative step closer, though something deep in my gut urged me to maintain a safe distance. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" I offered, glancing around the empty rest area to see if anyone else might be nearby who could help. "It's pretty late to be out here alone, especially for a woman in your condition." She nodded gratefully, looking relieved that someone had finally stopped to help her. "Yes, please. My friends and I were driving together, but somehow I got separated from them. I think they might be in serious trouble, and I need to find them as quickly as possible." Despite my growing reservations about the situation, I couldn't just abandon her there in the middle of nowhere. "All right, get in," I said, gesturing toward my truck. "I'll help you find your friends and get you somewhere safe where you can call for proper help." As she climbed into the passenger seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake. Her presence felt heavy and oppressive, as if the air had suddenly thickened around us, making it difficult to breathe normally. I tried to brush off these concerns, focusing instead on getting back on the road and helping this woman in distress. "Where were you and your friends headed?" I asked as I emerged back onto the interstate, trying to make conversation and gather information that might help locate her companions. "Just down the road," she said, staring out the window into the impenetrable darkness that surrounded us. "We were on our way to California for a music festival. I don't understand how I got separated from them or why I can't remember what happened." The highway stretched before us, empty except for the occasional vehicle zooming past in the opposite direction. Every few minutes I glanced at her, and each time she seemed more distant and ethereal, as if she were slowly fading away before my eyes like morning mist touched by sunlight. After driving for about 20 minutes through the Texas countryside, I suddenly saw something that made me slam on the brakes so hard that the truck skidded slightly on the asphalt. There, illuminated in my headlights, was another figure standing on the side of the road. "Did you see that?" I asked, my heart pounding with sudden adrenaline as I struggled to process what I had witnessed. She nodded slowly, her eyes wide with what appeared to be recognition and fear. "I think that might be one of my friends," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and terror that I couldn't quite understand. I rolled down my window and called out into the darkness. "Hello, do you need help?" The figure moved closer to my truck, stepping into the bright circle of my headlights, and my stomach dropped as I got a clear look at what stood before us. It was another woman, similarly disheveled with wild, unkempt hair and a frantic, desperate look in her eyes that spoke of recent trauma. "Please help me," she cried, her voice shaking with emotion. "I can't find my sister anywhere, and I'm terrified something terrible has happened to her." "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice rising with alarm as the situation became increasingly surreal and frightening. "They're in trouble," the second woman yelled, pointing frantically toward the dense woods that lined the highway. "You have to help us find them before it's too late. They're lost in there somewhere, and I can hear them calling for help." Before I could respond or ask any more questions, the woman who had been riding in my truck suddenly opened the passenger door and climbed out, joining the other woman on the roadside. "Wait! Come back!" I shouted, panic surging through me as I realized I was losing control of the situation entirely. But they were already running toward the woods, disappearing into the darkness between the trees, like spirits returning to their natural realm. I sat frozen in my truck for several long moments, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened and decide what I should do next. The smart thing would have been to drive away immediately, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever strange situation I had stumbled into. But something compelled me to investigate further, perhaps the same compassionate instinct that had led me to help the first woman in the first place. Story 8, the rest stop encounter. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years, and during that time, I've learned that the road can be both your greatest friend and your most terrifying enemy. I've driven through blizzards that could blind a man, desert heat that could melt steel, and fog so thick you couldn't see your own headlights. But nothing in all those years prepared me for what happened one cold October evening at an abandoned rest stop that most drivers had forgotten even existed. The day had started normally enough, picking up a load of fresh produce from a warehouse outside Sacramento, bound for a grocery distribution center in Chicago. The route was familiar, one I'd driven dozens of times before, winding through the mountains and across the desert plains of Nevada and Utah. The weather was crisp and clear, perfect for making good time and enjoying the spectacular views that never got old, no matter how many times I'd seen them. As evening approached and the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, I found myself on a particularly isolated stretch of highway known among truckers for its eerie atmosphere and strange occurrences. Most drivers preferred to push through this section without stopping, but fatigue was beginning to take its toll, and I knew I needed to rest before continuing. That's when I spotted it, an old rest stop that looked like it hadn't seen visitors in years, maybe even decades. The paint was peeling from the wooden structures, weeds had grown up through cracks in the asphalt, and several of the light poles were dark, their bulbs long since burned out and never replaced. Everything about the place screamed abandonment and neglect, yet something compelled me to pull in anyway. I parked my rig near what used to be the main building and stepped out into the chilly evening air. The silence was immediate and oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through broken windows and the rustle of leaves skittering across the cracked pavement. I stretched my legs and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me like a cold fog. The main building looked like it had once housed restrooms and perhaps a small visitor center, but now it stood as the hollow shell of its former self. Broken glass littered the ground near the entrances, and graffiti covered what remained of the walls, evidence of other travelers who had stopped here over the years, leaving their marks like modern cave paintings. As I approached the building, curiosity overcoming my better judgment, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the evening breeze. I pushed it open and stepped inside, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the interior. The air was stale and musty, filled with the scent of decay and abandonment. Debris covered the floor, and what remained of the fixtures hung at odd angles, like broken teeth in a skull. I was about to leave when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, sobbing sound, echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. My first instinct was to call out, to see if someone needed help, but something held me back. The sound was wrong somehow. Too hollow, too mournful to be entirely human. "Hello," I finally called out, my voice echoing off the broken walls. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The sobbing stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums like physical weight. Then I saw her, a figure standing in the far corner of the room, partially hidden in shadow. She was a woman, dressed in what appeared to be a tattered white dress that hung in shreds around her thin frame. Her hair was long and unkempt, hanging down to obscure her face like a dark curtain. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward while keeping my phone's light trained on her. She didn't respond, didn't even seem to acknowledge that I had spoken. She just stood there, swaying slightly as if moved by some unfelt breeze. As I moved closer, I could see that her dress was stained with what looked like old blood, dark patches that had long since dried to the color of rust. Her feet were bare and appeared to be cut and bleeding, as if she had been walking across broken glass for miles. But it was when she finally looked up that I felt my heart nearly stop beating. Her face was pale as moonlight, almost translucent, and her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion of her eyes, like looking into twin pools of ink. When she smiled, I could see that several of her teeth were missing, and those that remained were stained dark with what I hoped was just old blood but feared might be something worse. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice carrying a strange echo as if it were coming from very far away or from the bottom of a deep well. "This place is not for the living. This place is for those who have nowhere else to go." I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't seem to make my legs move fast enough. "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was here. I'll just be going now, and I won't bother you anymore." She laughed then, a sound like wind chimes made of bone being stirred by a hurricane. "Oh, but you can't leave now. You've seen too much, and you know too much. The others will be so happy to have someone new to talk to. It gets lonely here, so very lonely, and we don't get many visitors anymore." As she spoke, I became aware of other sounds in the building. Whispers coming from the walls themselves. Soft footsteps on floors that creaked despite being empty. And what sounded like multiple voices having conversations in rooms that I knew were vacant. The temperature seemed to drop by 20 degrees in a matter of seconds, and I could see my breath forming white clouds in the beam of my flashlight. "What others?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. She gestured around the building with one pale, skeletal hand. "All the travelers who stopped here over the years. All the drivers who thought they could just rest for a few minutes and then continue on their way. They're all still here, you know. They're all still waiting for the road to call them back, but the road doesn't want them anymore. The road has forgotten them, just like everyone else." Story 9, The Phantom Highway. I've spent over a decade driving trucks across America, but one night stands out in my memory like a scar that never quite heals properly. It was a cold evening in November, and I was approaching the final leg of a long haul from Texas to California. The sun had disappeared hours ago, leaving only an endless black ribbon of highway stretched out before me, illuminated by my headlights and the countless stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear desert air. The isolation weighed heavily on me as I drove through the emptiness. My radio was tuned to a country station, but static made it difficult to focus on the music, so mostly I listened to the steady hum of my engine and the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard at 2:47 in the morning and felt the familiar sensation of existing in a world where time had slowed to a crawl. I was traveling through a stretch of road that drivers called the Phantom Highway, notorious among truckers for strange sightings and unexplained accidents. Seasoned drivers shared stories of lost souls wandering the roadside at night, and while I had never been one to believe in ghost stories, something about this particular stretch always made me feel uneasy, as if the very air was charged with otherworldly energy. Just as I was approaching the infamous mile marker that every trucker knew by heart, I noticed something unusual on the side of the road. A small flickering light that danced in the darkness like a firefly that had lost its way. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowed down to investigate, pulling onto the shoulder with my hazard lights blinking. As I got closer, I could see that the light was actually a small campfire, and next to it stood a woman dressed entirely in white. Her clothing seemed to glow in the firelight, creating an almost ethereal appearance that made her look like she had stepped out of a dream or a nightmare. I rolled down my window and called out to her. "Hey there, you all right?" I asked, keeping my engine running and my foot near the gas pedal, though I couldn't quite explain why I felt the need to be ready for a quick escape. The woman looked up at me, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes were wide with an expression that seemed to combine fear and desperation in equal measure. "Please help me," she said, her voice trembling like leaves in an autumn wind. "I need a ride. Something terrible has happened and I can't stay here any longer." Something in her tone sent shivers down my spine, but the part of me that had always tried to help people in need wouldn't let me simply drive away. "Where are you headed?" I asked, studying her face for any signs that might explain her distress. "Just up the road," she replied, pointing into the darkness beyond my headlights. "There's a place where I used to feel safe, but I got lost somehow. My friends, they left me behind when things went wrong, and now I don't know how to get back to where I belong." Against every instinct that was screaming at me to leave immediately, I unlocked the passenger door. "All right, get in. It's not safe for anyone to be out here alone at this hour, especially not a woman." As she climbed into the truck, I noticed that her skin felt unusually cold when she brushed against my arm, almost as if she had been standing in freezing temperatures despite the mild desert night. We drove in relative silence for several minutes, the only sounds being the rumble of the engine and the soft whisper of wind through the slightly open windows. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, noticing how she seemed to be lost in thought, staring blankly ahead with an expression that suggested she was seeing something far beyond the road in front of us. "How long have you been out here?" I finally asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence that had settled between us like a thick fog. "I'm not sure," she replied softly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the truck. "Time seems different now, like it moves in circles instead of straight lines. Sometimes I feel like I've been walking along this road forever, and other times it seems like I just arrived moments ago." Her words sent another chill through me, but I pressed on with my questions, hoping to understand her situation better. "What happened to your friends? Why did they leave you behind?" She turned to look at me then, and I was struck by how her eyes seemed to reflect the dashboard lights in an unusual way, almost like the eyes of an animal caught in headlights. "They couldn't see me anymore," she said, with a sadness that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. "After the accident, everything changed. I tried to call out to them, tried to make them understand that I was still there, but they acted like I had simply vanished into thin air." "What accident?" I asked, though part of me was beginning to suspect that I didn't want to hear the answer. "The one that brought me here," she whispered, her voice becoming even quieter. "The one that made it impossible for me to leave this stretch of highway, no matter how hard I try or how far I walk. I've been searching for a way home ever since, but the road just keeps bringing me back to the same place over and over again." As she spoke, I became aware that the temperature inside the cab was dropping steadily despite the heater running at full capacity. My breath was beginning to form small clouds, and I could see frost starting to form on the inside of the windows. The radio, which had been playing soft static, suddenly went completely silent. "Where exactly am I taking you?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly as fear began to override my desire to help. "To the place where it all ended," she said, pointing ahead to where my headlights were beginning to illuminate what looked like the twisted remains of a vehicle on the side of the road. "To the place where I learned that some journeys never really end. They just continue in ways we never expected." As we approached the wreckage, I could see that it was the burned-out shell of what had once been a car, now little more than a skeleton of rusted metal and melted plastic. The sight of it filled me with a dread so profound that I felt like I might be sick. I stopped the truck and turned to look at my passenger, but the seat beside me was empty. The woman was gone, vanished as completely as if she had never been there at all. The only evidence of her presence was the lingering smell of smoke and the frost that still covered the windows despite the desert heat that had returned to the cab. I sat there for several minutes, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside and examine the wreckage more closely, I found a small memorial plaque that someone had placed near the twisted metal. It bore the name of a young woman who had died in a car accident on this very spot 3 years earlier, along with a photograph that showed the same face I had just spent 20 minutes talking to. I drove away from that place as quickly as my truck would carry me, but the memory of that night has stayed with me ever since. Sometimes, when I'm driving through lonely stretches of highway in the small hours of the morning, I find myself looking for campfires by the side of the road, half expecting to see her standing there again, still searching for a way home that will always remain just beyond her reach. Story 10. The Woods Beyond the Highway. I've been a truck driver for nearly 15 years, and in that time I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous encounters happen not on the highway itself, but in the places where civilization ends and something older and more primitive begins. This story takes place on a route through the deep woods of northern Maine, where the trees grow so thick that sunlight barely penetrates even during the brightest days of summer. It was late autumn, and I was hauling a load of lumber from a mill near Bangor to a construction site outside Boston. The route was familiar enough, though I had always found this particular stretch of highway somewhat unsettling. The forest pressed in close on both sides, creating a green tunnel that seemed to swallow sound and light alike, leaving travelers feeling isolated and vulnerable despite being on a major thoroughfare. The sun was setting earlier now that we were deep into October, and by 6 o'clock, the woods were already cloaked in premature twilight. I had been driving for 8 hours and was beginning to feel the familiar weight of fatigue settling over me like a heavy blanket. My eyes were getting dry and scratchy, and I found myself blinking more frequently to keep them focused on the road ahead. When I spotted a rest area sign promising facilities just 2 miles ahead, I decided it was time to take a break. The rest area, when I reached it, was smaller than most. Just a gravel parking lot carved out of the forest, with a single building that housed restrooms and vending machines. A few picnic tables were scattered around the perimeter, though they looked like they hadn't been used in years. I pulled my rig into the lot and climbed out, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from hours of sitting. The air was crisp and carried the rich scent of decomposing leaves and pine needles. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of running water, probably a stream that wound through the forest beyond the rest area boundaries. After using the facilities and grabbing a cup of coffee from one of the vending machines, I decided to take a short walk around the perimeter of the rest area to get my blood flowing again. The walking path was well maintained and led toward the sound of running water I had heard earlier. Signs along the path warned visitors to stay on the marked trail and not to venture into the woods alone, especially after dark. I followed the path for about a quarter mile until I reached a small wooden bridge that crossed a babbling brook. The water was clear and cold, flowing over smooth stones that had been polished by countless years of erosion. I stood on the bridge for a few minutes, enjoying the peaceful sound of moving water and the way the last rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy above. That's when I heard a sound that didn't belong in this peaceful setting. It was a voice, faint but clearly human, calling out from somewhere deeper in the woods. The voice sounded distressed, almost panicked, and seemed to be calling for help. My first instinct was to respond, to call back and see if someone was in trouble, but something held me back. The sound came again, closer this time, and I could make out words. "Help me, please, I'm lost." It was a woman's voice, young and frightened, echoing through the trees in a way that made it impossible to determine exactly where it was coming from. Every instinct I had told me that someone was in genuine distress and needed assistance. But another part of my mind whispered warnings about leaving the safety of the marked trail. I called back, "Where are you? I can hear you, but I can't see you." My voice seemed to be absorbed by the forest, swallowed up by the thick vegetation, before it could travel very far. The response came immediately, but from a different direction than the previous calls. "Over here, by the big oak tree. I hurt my ankle and I can't walk." The voice was definitely closer now, and seemed to be coming from a thick grove of trees about 50 yards off the main path. I could see what might have been the oak tree she was referring to, a massive specimen that towered above the surrounding forest. Against my better judgment, I left the path and began making my way through the underbrush toward the sound of the voice. The going was difficult, with thick brambles that caught at my clothes and hidden roots that threatened to trip me with every step. The deeper I went into the woods, the darker it became, as the canopy above grew thicker and blocked out what little daylight remained. I had been walking for about 10 minutes when I realized that I could no longer hear the woman's voice. I stopped and called out again, "Hello? Are you still there? I'm coming to help you." But the forest had fallen completely silent. Even the sound of the stream had faded to nothing, and I couldn't hear any of the normal forest sounds. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Looking around, I realized that I was no longer entirely sure which direction I had come from. The trees all looked the same in the growing darkness, and the underbrush was so thick that I couldn't see more than a few yards in any direction. Panic began to creep in as I understood that I might be lost myself. I pulled out my cell phone to use its flashlight, but the screen showed no signal bars at all. Even worse, the battery indicator showed that the phone was nearly dead, despite having been fully charged when I left that morning. The flashlight beam seemed weak and ineffective, barely penetrating the darkness that surrounded me on all sides. That's when I heard the voice again, but this time it sounded different, less human somehow, with an echoing quality that raised the hair on the back of my neck. "Thank you for coming," it said, and I realized that the words seemed to be coming from directly above me, as if someone were speaking from the treetops. I looked up and felt my blood turn to ice. There, perched on a thick branch about 20 feet above my head, was a figure that might once have been human, but was now something else entirely. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and bent at angles that should have been impossible. Its skin was pale and seemed to glow with a sickly phosphorescence that provided the only real light in the dark forest. "You shouldn't have left the path," the thing said in a voice that was definitely not the same one that had been calling for help. "The path is safe, but here in the deep woods, different rules apply. Here, we decide who stays and who gets to leave." I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush without any regard for the noise I was making or the direction I was heading. Branches whipped at my face and thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't dare stop or slow down. Behind me I could hear sounds of pursuit, not footsteps exactly, but a rustling and crackling that suggested something large was moving through the trees, following my path. Story 11. The Empty Highway. I've been driving trucks for most of my adult life, and I've always found comfort in the rhythm of the road, the steady hum of the engine, the gentle vibration of tires on asphalt, and the endless ribbon of highway stretching toward the horizon. But there's one night that stands out from all the others, a night when the familiar comfort of the road transformed into something altogether more sinister and threatening. It was the middle of winter, and I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix, a route that would take me through some of the most desolate stretches of highway in the country. The weather had been cooperating for most of the trip with clear skies and good visibility, but as I entered a particularly remote section of Interstate 40 in New Mexico, things began to change in ways that still make me question my sanity. The sun had set hours earlier, and I was driving through a landscape that seemed utterly devoid of human presence. No towns, no houses, no other vehicles. Just endless miles of desert on both sides of the highway, illuminated only by my headlights and the pale glow of a half-moon overhead. The radio had been losing station steadily as I drove deeper into the wilderness, and now there was nothing but static on every frequency. Around midnight, I began to notice something strange about the road itself. The familiar landmarks that I used to gauge my progress, mile markers, exit signs, overpasses, seemed to be repeating in patterns that didn't make sense. I passed the same rock formation 3 times in what should have been 30 miles of straight highway. The same billboards appeared and reappeared with unsettling regularity. At first I attributed this to fatigue and the hypnotic effect of long-distance driving. It wasn't uncommon for tired drivers to experience mild hallucinations or confusion, especially on monotonous stretches of highway. I pulled over at what appeared to be a rest area, though I couldn't remember seeing it on any map, and stepped out to clear my head with some fresh air. The rest area was strangely pristine, as if it had been built recently but never used. The facilities were clean and well maintained. The vending machines were fully stocked and operational, but there were no signs that anyone else had ever stopped there. No litter, no wear patterns on the pavement, no graffiti or other evidence of human presence. I used the restroom and bought a cup of coffee from one of the machines, hoping the caffeine would help me stay alert for the remaining hours of my drive. But when I returned to my truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The odometer, which had shown over 200,000 miles when I parked, now read exactly 0. The trip meter, the engine hours, even the radio presets. Everything had been reset as if the truck had just rolled off the assembly line. Telling myself that it must be some kind of electrical malfunction, I climbed back into the cab and continued driving. But as the miles passed, I began to realize that something fundamental had changed about my situation. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, with no variation in scenery and no signs of approaching dawn despite the fact that I had been driving all night. My fuel gauge, which should have been approaching empty by this point, remained stubbornly at 3/4 full. The clock on my dashboard seemed to be moving normally, but when I checked my watch, the hands hadn't moved at all. The stars overhead maintained the same positions they had held when I first noticed them hours earlier, as if time itself had become frozen in this desolate place. I tried using my CB radio to contact other drivers, but heard only empty static on every channel. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this remote area, but it also showed a battery level that never seemed to change, no matter how long I used it. Everything about my situation suggested that I had somehow slipped out of the normal flow of time and space. The road signs, when they appeared, showed destinations that I had never heard of. Towns with names like Nowhere Springs, Population 0 Junction, and Last Chance Crossing. The exit numbers increased normally for a while, then began counting backward, then jumped to seemingly random 3-digit combinations that made no mathematical sense. As I continued driving through this impossible landscape, I began to see other vehicles on the road. Trucks, cars, and motorcycles that appeared briefly in my headlights before vanishing into the darkness ahead or behind me. When I tried to catch up with them or flag them down, they would disappear as if they had never been there at all. The other drivers, when I could see them clearly enough, all had the same expression of confusion and fear that I was beginning to feel myself. They were trapped just as I was, caught in some kind of temporal loop or dimensional pocket that existed alongside the normal highway system but operated according to different rules entirely. I don't know how long I drove through that nightmare landscape, hours, days, weeks. It was impossible to tell. The fuel gauge never moved, the sun never rose, and the endless highway continued to stretch ahead without any sign of leading anywhere. I began to wonder if this was what death was like. An eternal journey with no destination, trapped forever in the cab of a truck that would never need fuel or maintenance. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the strangeness ended. I crested a small hill and saw the lights of a truck stop in the distance. Real lights connected to real buildings, with real people inside. The radio crackled back to life with a late-night talk show. The stars resumed their normal movement across the sky, and my fuel gauge dropped to where it should have been all along. I pulled into that truck stop and sat in the parking lot for an hour, just watching normal people go about their normal business. The truckers checking their loads, travelers buying snacks and coffee, families with children using the restrooms. Everything was exactly as it should be, as if the hours I had spent on that impossible highway had never happened at all. When I finally worked up the courage to check my logbook and GPS, I discovered that I had somehow covered the exact distance I should have during the missing time, arriving precisely when my schedule indicated I would. but I knew that I had experienced something beyond normal reality, something that existed in the spaces between the mapped and measured world. To this day, I can't explain what happened on that stretch of highway, but I know that somewhere out there, parallel to our normal roads, there are other highways where different rules apply and where travelers can become lost in ways that have nothing to do with wrong turns or missed exits. Story 12. The Midnight Caller. I've been hauling freight across America for the better part of 2 decades, and I thought I had encountered every possible situation the road could throw at me. I've driven through blizzards that turned highways into skating rinks, thunderstorms that split the sky with lightning, and heat waves that made the asphalt shimmer like water, but nothing in all those years prepared me for the night when my CB radio became a conduit for something that shouldn't have been able to reach across the divide between the living and the dead. It was a humid summer evening in August, and I was driving a load of agricultural equipment from Omaha to Little Rock, following Interstate 35 through the heart of Missouri. The traffic was light, as it usually is during the late evening hours, with only the occasional car or fellow trucker sharing the highway with me as the miles rolled steadily beneath my wheels. Around 11 o'clock, as I was passing through a particularly rural stretch of highway bordered by cornfields that stretched to the horizon on both sides, my CB radio crackled to life with a transmission that immediately caught my attention. It wasn't the usual chatter between drivers about traffic conditions or weather reports, but something far more personal and desperate. "Breaker 19, this is Lost Soul looking for help," the voice said, and something about its tone made my skin crawl with unease. "I've been trying to reach someone, anyone, for what feels like forever. Can anybody hear me out there?" I picked up the microphone and responded. "This is Eastbound Eddie. I can hear you loud and clear. What's your situation, driver? Are you broken down somewhere and need assistance?" There was a long pause before the voice came back, filled with a sadness that seemed to echo from somewhere deep and dark. "I don't think I'm broken down exactly, but I can't seem to find my way back to where I'm supposed to be. I've been driving for so long that I've lost track of time completely." Something about the way he spoke sent chills down my spine, but I tried to maintain a helpful attitude. "Where are you trying to get to? Maybe I can help you figure out your location and get you pointed in the right direction?" "That's the problem," the voice replied, and I could hear what sounded like genuine confusion and fear. "I can't remember where I was going or where I came from. All I know is that I've been on this road for longer than seems possible, and nothing looks familiar anymore." I glanced at my GPS and checked the mile markers to get a precise fix on my location. "Well, I'm currently at mile marker 67 on Interstate 35 in Missouri, heading south toward Arkansas. Where does your GPS show you to be?" The response that came back made my blood run cold. "I don't have a GPS anymore, and I can't find any mile markers. The road I'm on doesn't seem to have any signs at all, just endless asphalt stretching in both directions. I haven't seen another vehicle in hours, maybe days." I tried to process what he was telling me, but it didn't make sense according to any normal understanding of how the highway system worked. "What's the last thing you remember clearly? When did you last stop for fuel or food?" "I think I stopped at a truck stop somewhere, but when I try to remember the details, everything gets fuzzy and unclear," the voice said, growing more agitated with each word. "I remember talking to someone there, another driver, who warned me about something, but I can't recall what the warning was about." As I listened to his story, I began to feel increasingly uneasy about the entire conversation. Something about his voice, about the way it seemed to fade in and out despite the strong signal strength, reminded me of stories other drivers had told about phantom transmissions from truckers who had died on the road, but somehow continued trying to communicate through their radios. "What's your name, driver?" I asked, hoping to get some concrete information that might help me understand what was happening. "I think it's Mike, but even that doesn't feel certain anymore," he replied. Everything about who I used to be seems to be slipping away, like water running through my fingers. The only thing that remains clear is this overwhelming need to find my way home. I spent the next hour talking with Mike, trying to help him piece together his memories and figure out his situation. He described driving through landscapes that didn't match any geography I knew, passing through towns with names that didn't appear on any map, and encountering other travelers who seemed just as lost and confused as he was. As we talked, I began to notice that the signal quality was deteriorating. Not in the usual way that happened when vehicles moved apart, but in a more fundamental way, as if the transmission was coming from an increasingly great distance. His voice started to sound hollow and echoing, like someone speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "I can feel myself fading," Mike said during one of our exchanges, and there was a panic in his voice that made my heart race. "It's like I'm being pulled away from this frequency, away from any connection to the world I used to know. Please, if you're still there, don't let me disappear completely." I keyed the microphone and spoke as clearly and forcefully as I could. "I'm still here, Mike. I'm not going anywhere. Just keep talking and stay focused on the sound of my voice. Maybe if you concentrate hard enough, you can find your way back to wherever you belong." But the static was getting worse with each transmission, and his voice was becoming fainter and more distorted. I could barely make out his words as he said, "Thank you for listening, for being there when I needed someone to talk to. I think I can see some lights ahead now, lights that look like they might lead somewhere safe." "That's good, Mike," I replied, though I wasn't sure he could still hear me clearly. "Follow those lights and don't look back. Maybe they'll take you where you need to go." His final transmission was so faint that I had to strain to hear it at all. "I think I can see them now, the people I've been looking for. They're waiting for me just ahead. Thank you for helping me find my way home." After that, there was only silence on the frequency, no matter how many times I called his name or tried to raise him on the radio. I drove through the rest of the night in contemplative silence, thinking about Mike and wondering what had really happened during our conversation. The next morning, when I stopped for breakfast at a truck stop in Arkansas, I overheard two drivers talking about a memorial service they had attended the previous week for a fellow trucker named Mike, who had died in an accident on Interstate 35 in Missouri. According to their conversation, he had been found in his cab after jackknifing on a curve during a thunderstorm, apparently trying to reach for his CB radio when the crash occurred. I never told anyone about my conversation with Mike that night, partly because I knew they wouldn't believe me, and partly because I preferred to think of it as a final kindness, giving a lost soul the chance to say goodbye before moving on to whatever comes next. Story 13, The Final Rest Stop. I've been driving trucks for 15 years now, and I've always prided myself on being a practical, no-nonsense kind of guy who doesn't believe in things that can't be explained by logic and common sense. Ghosts, supernatural encounters, unexplained phenomena. All of that was just stories that drivers told to pass the time during long, lonely nights on the road. At least, that's what I believed, until I experienced something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality itself. The incident occurred during what should have been a routine run from Portland to Denver, carrying a load of computer equipment through some of the most beautiful but isolated country in the Pacific Northwest. It was late October, and the autumn colors were spectacular, brilliant reds and golds, painting the mountainsides like nature's own masterpiece, while crystal-clear streams wound through valleys that seemed untouched by human civilization. I had been driving for about 6 hours when I decided to stop at a rest area that I had never noticed before, despite having traveled this route dozens of times over the years. It was tucked away in a grove of ancient pine trees, accessible via a narrow access road that curved through the forest before opening into a small clearing with parking spaces and basic facilities. The rest area was completely deserted when I arrived, which wasn't unusual given the remote location and the late hour. What was unusual was how perfectly maintained everything appeared to be. The restrooms were spotlessly clean, the picnic tables looked like they had been installed yesterday, and the landscaping was manicured to a degree that seemed almost artificial in its perfection. I parked my rig and stepped out into the crisp mountain air, breathing deeply and enjoying the scent of pine needles and wood smoke that seemed to permeate the atmosphere. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of running water, probably a mountain stream flowing down from the peaks that surrounded this hidden valley. After using the facilities and stretching my legs with a short walk around the perimeter of the rest area, I decided to grab a quick meal from the supplies I kept in my cab. I was sitting at one of the picnic tables, enjoying a sandwich and a thermos of coffee, when I first noticed that something was odd about this place. Despite being completely alone, I kept hearing sounds that suggested other people were nearby. Distant conversations that were just too faint to make out clearly. The sound of car doors closing, and what might have been children playing somewhere in the woods. Every time I looked around to locate the source of these sounds, I saw nothing but empty parking spaces and silent forest. As the evening progressed and the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the rest area, the sounds became more distinct and frequent. I could hear what sounded like families having picnics, couples talking quietly on benches, and the general murmur of human activity that you would expect at a popular rest stop during peak hours. But when I looked directly at any spot where the sound seemed to be coming from, there was nothing there but empty space and gathering darkness. It was as if I were hearing echoes of activities that had taken place here at some other time, perhaps years or even decades ago, when this rest area had been busy with travelers making their way through the mountains. Curiosity overcoming my growing unease, I decided to explore the area more thoroughly to see if I could find some explanation for the phantom sounds. I walked along a narrow trail that led from the main rest area deeper into the forest, following the sound of running water that I had heard earlier. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked, winding through groves of towering evergreens and across small wooden bridges that spanned crystal clear streams. As I walked, the sounds of invisible activity continued around me, creating an atmosphere that was both peaceful and deeply unsettling at the same time. After about 10 minutes of walking, I came upon a small clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a spectacular view of the valley below. In the center of the clearing was a large stone monument that I hadn't noticed from the parking area, partially hidden by the surrounding vegetation. As I approached the monument, I could see that it was some kind of memorial, with names and dates carved into its polished granite surface. Reading the inscriptions more closely, I realized that this was a memorial to travelers who had died in accidents on this stretch of highway over the past several decades. The names ranged from recent dates back to the 1950s when this highway was first constructed through the mountains. Some of the entries included brief descriptions of the accidents, weather crashes, mechanical failures, and simple human error that had claimed the lives of drivers and passengers who were just trying to get from one place to another safely. As I stood there reading the names and thinking about the lives that had been cut short on these dangerous mountain roads, I began to understand what I had been experiencing. The sounds I was hearing weren't echoes from the past, but somehow the presence of those who had never made it to their final destinations, still trying to complete journeys that death had interrupted. Looking back toward the rest area, I could now see them, translucent figures moving among the picnic tables and parking spaces, families and individuals who appeared solid enough until you looked directly at them, at which point they would fade to near invisibility. They were going through the motions of normal rest stop activities, as if this place served as some kind of way station between the world of the living and whatever comes after. A young woman in 1960s clothing was pushing a child on a swing that I couldn't see. An elderly man in a vintage trucker's uniform was checking the engine of a rig that existed only in whatever realm he now inhabited. A family of 4 was having a picnic at a table that appeared empty when I looked directly at it, but seemed occupied in my peripheral vision. None of them seemed threatening or malevolent, just confused and lost, unable to accept that their journeys had ended and that they needed to move on to wherever spirits go when they finally let go of the physical world. They were stuck in a loop, eternally stopping at this rest area that existed in both the world of the living and the realm of the dead. As I watched these ghostly travelers, I felt a deep sadness for their situation, but also a growing understanding that this place served an important purpose. It was a sanctuary for those who had died suddenly and violently, a place where they could come to terms with their new state of existence before moving on to whatever awaited them beyond. I spent another hour at the memorial, reading the names and silently acknowledging each person who had died on these treacherous mountain roads. As I did so, I noticed that some of the ghostly figures began to fade away entirely, as if my recognition of their stories had somehow given them permission to complete their interrupted journeys. When I finally returned to my truck and prepared to continue my own journey, I felt a profound sense of peace about what I had experienced. I had been privileged to witness something that most people never see, proof that death is not an ending but a transition, and that love and compassion can bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Driving away from that rest area, I knew that I would never forget what I had seen there, and that my understanding of the world had been forever changed by my encounter with travelers who had never reached their destinations, but had found a different kind of peace in that hidden sanctuary among the mountains.